Hey there, and welcome back. If you have come here tonight ready to be carried somewhere, settle in. Let your head find the pillow you mean to keep it on. Let the blanket rest where you want it to rest. Close your eyes if you would like to, or leave them open in the dim of wherever you are listening from. Let your mind drift, just for a moment, to the idea of getting on a train at the end of a long day, finding the berth that has been made up for you, watching the lit window of the carriage as the city begins to slide away outside it, and lying down to sleep while 400 miles of country pass beneath you in the dark. That is the journey we are going to make tonight. The country we are going to cross is England in the late summer of 1888. The bed at the end of the night is in Scotland, and between here and there is the long ribbon of railway, the lit carriages, the gas-lit stations passing in the dark, the engine and its crew working through the small hours, and the slow, steady rocking of the sleeper through the night. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I am glad you are here. If you are new to the channel, you might think about subscribing. It helps the long, quiet histories find the people who would want them. And in the comments, if you feel like it, tell me where you are listening from. Because the experience of being carried through the dark while the world sleeps around you is something the night sleeper gave the Victorians for the first time in human history, and it is something a great many of us still know in our own way. Anyone who has lain on a train or a coach or a plane and felt the country move beneath them while they let go of the day. Tonight you are going to do that, in your imagination, in the company of an English railway, in the 8th decade of its existence, on the route between London and Glasgow that the West Coast Company had been refining for 40 years, and that, in the summer we are about to step into, was the subject of the most famous railway drama the country had ever seen. We will get to that. For now, let me take you to the station. The year is 1888. It is late July. The Queen has been on the throne for 51 years, and her Golden Jubilee, the year before last, is still being talked about in the houses you would have passed on your way to Euston this evening. Mr. Gladstone is out of office, having lost his Home Rule Bill 2 summers ago. Lord Salisbury is Prime Minister. The Empire stands at something close to its full extent. The country is at peace. The cities are growing. The railways have been the central fact of British economic life for half a century, and London has become, more than any city in the world, a place that is connected by rail to everywhere else. There are 15 great railway termini ringing the centre of London, each of them the head office of a different railway company, each of them a kind of palace of arrival and departure, each of them owning its own miles of track, and its own fleet of engines, and its own peculiar architectural personality. Tonight you are leaving from Euston. Euston is the oldest of them. Euston is also, by some measures, the proudest. You arrived at Euston this evening by hansom cab, having dined early at the hotel where you have been staying for the past 3 days. The hansom cab, the familiar two-wheeled vehicle pulled by a single horse with the driver perched at the rear above and behind the passenger, was the principal way of moving across central London in 1888 for anyone who could afford the fare. The cab had been invented by Joseph Hansom in 1834, refined by John Chapman in 1836, and adopted as the standard London cab by the 1850s. By 1888 there were perhaps 11,000 hansoms in service in the city, with their distinctive lacquered black bodies and their drivers in their long coats and battered top hats, and they had become one of the visual emblems of late Victorian London. The hansom moved through traffic faster than the four-wheeled growler. The hansom protected the passenger from the weather. The hansom allowed conversation between passenger and driver through the hatch in the roof, by which fares were arranged and destinations confirmed. The hansom was, in 1888, what the taxicab would become a generation later. You had taken yours from the hotel in Mayfair. The drive across central London on a July evening, with the gas lamps just being lit along the streets and the long summer dusk still showing pale above the rooftops, was one of the pleasurable rituals of late Victorian travel, the sight of the West End shops with their last customers, the tide of evening pedestrians along Piccadilly, the cabs and carriages converging on the theatres, the distant towers of the Houses of Parliament dim against the southwestern sky. The cab had taken you up Park Lane and across Marble Arch, and along the Edgware Road and east along the New Road, and the city had been showing, as it always did at this hour, the particular character of a London summer evening, the low sun, the long shadows, the warm air smelling of horses and of coal smoke and of the dust of dry streets. By the time the cab turned into the long forecourt of Euston, the dusk had thickened into something closer to night, and the gas lamps in the streets had become the principal illumination, and the great city had begun to settle into the long routines of its evening life. The cab has set you down in the great forecourt of the station, between the two flanking lodges, and you have stepped out into a square of activity that has been gathering force since 7 o'clock. There are carriages and cabs depositing other passengers. There are porters with iron-rimmed luggage trolleys. There are gentlemen in evening dress, and ladies in travelling cloaks, and children being shepherded along by nursemaids, and the long uniformed figures of the railway servants, directing the flow with the brisk authority that the railway companies trained into their men. Above all of this, framing the whole scene, rises the great Doric Arch of Euston, the most famous piece of railway architecture in the country, built in 1837 to mark the entrance to the first intercity line out of London. The arch is 60 feet high. It is built of Yorkshire sandstone. It has stood here for 51 years, and it stands here tonight in the brassy gold of the gas-lit summer dusk, with the lit windows of the booking hall behind it, looking exactly like what it was always meant to look like, a triumphal entrance to a kingdom of distance. You walk through the arch. The forecourt gives way to the long approach to the booking hall. The booking hall is the Great Hall, which the Victorians built in 1849 to give Euston the kind of monumental interior that the line's importance seemed to require. It is 125 feet long. The ceiling is coffered. There is a sweeping double staircase at the far end, leading up to the meeting room of the company directors. The walls are lined with portraits of George Stephenson and Robert Stephenson and the other heroes of the early railway age. The whole space is lit by gas chandeliers hanging on long brass chains from the coffered ceiling, and the gas is turned up high tonight because the evening trains for the north are loading and the hall is full. You cross it. Your footsteps and the footsteps of every other late evening traveller make a confused echo in the stone. There is a clock above the booking office that reads 7:25. The great hall in its time was one of the more deliberately impressive interiors in London. The architects had wanted the visitor entering Euston to understand, immediately, that the railway was a serious institution, that the journeys it offered were significant journeys, that the company commanding such a building was a company of national importance. The hall achieved that. The painters and journalists who describe Euston in the 1850s and 1860s used the language usually reserved for cathedrals and palaces. It was, they said, the gateway to the north of England and to Scotland, and the gateway had been built to a scale that matched the country it served. At Athena, you will, by 1888, be walking through a great hall that has begun to feel slightly worn around the edges. The gas chandeliers a little smoke-darkened, the carpet on the staircase a little threadbare, the brass fittings polished but no longer new. The hall has been in continuous use for nearly 40 years. It has been crossed by perhaps 100 million pairs of footsteps in that time. It has seen the departures and arrivals of 3 monarchs, of a dozen prime ministers, of the great writers and engineers and military men of the Victorian century. It has its own silent accumulation of history, and it remains in 1888 the principal entrance hall to the principal railway terminus of London, and the place where the night journeys to Scotland begin. You have your ticket already, bought in advance from the company's West End office. It is a first-class single to Glasgow Central, with a Pullman berth reserved in coach number 72. The ticket is on rust-coloured pasteboard, printed with the company's coat of arms, and the date stamped in dark ink. You have put it in your inner coat pocket, where it will be checked by the guard once you have boarded, and again when the steward makes up your berth, and again when the train reaches the border in the small hours, and a Caledonian railway inspector will pass through to count the through passengers. You have been told all of this by the booking clerk this morning. The night sleeper to Scotland has its own etiquette, and its own staff, and its own way of being travelled, and the company has refined the etiquette over the past 15 years until the journey, for those who can afford it, has become one of the most comfortable long-distance experiences in the world. Beyond the booking hall, the station opens into the train shed. This is the part of Euston the Victorians had built and rebuilt over the past 40 years to handle the enormous traffic the line had grown into, and which by 1888 was reaching the limits of what the original plan could absorb. There are 7 platforms here. The roof above is iron and glass, blackened on the inside by half a century of locomotive smoke. The whole shed is dim where the smoke has gathered up under the roof, and brighter where the platform gas lamps and the lit carriages on the standing trains throw their illumination upward. The air smells of coal smoke and machine oil, and the warm metallic exhalation that locomotives at rest give off, the breath of the engines themselves, sighing as they wait to leave. There is a hiss, somewhere on the next platform, of steam being released from a safety valve. There is the regular bell of a hand trolley being wheeled past you. There is the call of a porter announcing the platform for the Birmingham Express. There is faintly the distant whistle of an engine in one of the goods yards beyond the passenger station, where the work of moving the country's freight goes on through the night while the passenger trains take their turn at the platforms. You find platform 13. The night sleeper to Glasgow is already drawn up. Its locomotive is at the far end, hidden in the dim where the train shed darkens toward the open mouth of the cutting, and its long line of carriages stretches the length of the platform with their windows blazing yellow into the evening. There are perhaps 14 vehicles on the train tonight. The Pullman sleepers are unmistakable in the line, longer, taller, more handsomely finished than the regular first-class carriages on either side of them, painted in the cream and brown livery that the Pullman Company had brought across from America, and that had become, by 1888, the visible badge of the most expensive train travel the country could offer. There are the dining carriage and the saloon car, also longer and more finished than the others. There are the regular first-class and second-class composites for passengers travelling shorter distances or in the cheaper grade. There is the brake van at each end. There is the post office sorting carriage, which the Royal Mail has hired from the company and fitted out for its night work, marked with the broad red band along its side that says it is on Crown service. The whole train, lit from inside through every window, looks tonight like a long line of warm rooms drawn up against the cool dim of the train shed, waiting to be set in motion. The locomotive at the far end is just visible if you walk a few paces forward. A web compound with its tall chimney and its high splashers and the brass safety valve cover polished to a soft gleam under the platform gas lamps. There is a wisp of steam from somewhere near the cab. There is a man in overalls walking around the engine with an oil can in his hand, checking the bearings of the leading wheels. The driver is leaning out of the cab and speaking to the shed foreman who has come down the platform with a clipboard. A boy with a broom is sweeping the platform ahead of the engine. The whole tableau, in the brassy gold of the gas-lit train shed at 7:45 on a July evening, is one of the iconic images of the late Victorian railway, and it is being assembled exactly as it has been assembled for every evening departure of the night sleeper for the past 15 years. You walk along the platform toward the front of the train. Your coach is number 72 near the dining car. Porters are loading luggage into the brake van. A guard with a green flag and a brass whistle is checking his watch. A railway servant in uniform is walking the length of the train, inspecting the gas lamps inside the carriages, making sure each one is burning correctly. A travelling postal worker is heaving a leather mailbag up the step of the post office carriage. The platform clock now reads 20 to 8. Departure is at 5 to 8. The bustle has the controlled urgency of a station that has been dispatching the night train to the north every weekday evening for 15 years, and that knows exactly how long every part of the routine takes. You have time. You walk slowly. You let yourself look at the train. There is a particular pleasure in this kind of looking, which the regular night sleeper passengers came to recognize over the years. You stand on the platform with your bag on the trolley beside you, and you take in the long line of lit carriages, and the great dim form of the locomotive at the head of them, and the activity of the railway staff up and down the platform, and you let yourself be in the moment of departure that has not yet come. The journey is about to begin. The bed is about to be lain in. The country is about to begin to roll past the window. But for these few minutes, you are still in London, still on the platform, still poised between the day that is ending and the night that is opening. And the poise itself is a small pleasure that you can recognize as you stand there. The Victorians had a feeling for these moments. The painters of the railway scene knew it. The novelists who wrote departure scenes knew it. And the regular travellers who used the night sleeper knew it well. The suspended minute on the lit platform before the train would take them away, with the city behind them and the dark country ahead, and the journey not yet quite begun. This is one of the great visual pleasures of being a railway traveller in the late 19th century, and it is one that has been almost entirely lost to us in the age that came after. To stand on the platform of a great terminus while a long train waits to leave, with its locomotive simmering at the head of it, and its lit carriages stretching back into the gloom, and its passengers boarding in their travelling clothes, and the railway staff working through the visible last rituals before departure, is to be at the centre of one of the most coordinated and most romantic forms of transport that human beings have ever devised. The Victorians knew this. They wrote about it. They painted it. They photographed it as soon as the technology allowed. The image of the lit train at the platform, ready to set off into the night, is one of the central images of the period, and it is one that anyone in 1888 who travelled by sleeper to Scotland would have stopped to look at. Just as you are stopping now, you reach coach 72. The Pullman steward is standing at the open vestibule door, in his white linen jacket, with the silver badge on his lapel that says he is in the company's service. He is a man of perhaps 40, dark-haired, alert, with the practiced civility of someone who has been doing this work for 15 years and who has learned that the night sleeper to Glasgow runs best when the steward keeps everything moving, without ever appearing to hurry anyone. He nods to you. He asks for your name. He checks it against the list in his hand. He says, "Good evening, miss. Your berth is the second on the right. The bed is made up. The lavatory is at the far end. And we will be away in 15 minutes. He stands aside to let you board. You step up into the carriage. The step itself is a small physical moment that the regular Pullman passenger came to know. The cast iron tread at the bottom, the brass handrail polished by 10,000 hands, the slight upward lift required to get from platform level to vestibule level, the first impression of the warm interior air on your face after the cool air of the train shed. The vestibule has a polished brass door fitting and a small mirror on the bulkhead opposite the entrance, in which you catch a glimpse of yourself as you enter your hat, your travelling cloak, the tired face of someone who has spent 3 days in London and is now going north. You step past the mirror into the corridor proper. The corridor is carpeted. The gas mantles are turned to half. The smell is the smell of any well-kept Pullman at the start of a journey. Beeswax polish on the mahogany, fresh laundry from the made-up berths, a faint trace of the steward's bay rum, and underneath all of that, the warm, dry air of the heating system, which has been running since the train was prepared this afternoon. The interior of a Pullman sleeper in 1888 is something the Victorian travelling public regards as among the closer experiences to luxury that the railway age has produced. The carriages were designed in Chicago in the late 1860s by an American carpenter and building mover named George Mortimer Pullman, who had decided that the existing American sleeping cars were not nearly comfortable enough. The first Pullmans ran in the United States in 1865 on the funeral train of Abraham Lincoln. By 1873, Mr. Pullman had crossed the Atlantic with a contract for the Midland Railway. The LNWR had followed within the year, and the white-jacketed Pullman stewards have been a feature of the West Coast night services ever since. The carriage you are stepping into now is one of the results. The interior runs to a long central corridor with the berths arranged on either side, separated from the corridor by varnished mahogany partitions and curtained doorways. Each berth is a private compartment, perhaps 6 feet by 7, with a bed that has been made up by the steward in clean white linen, a folding washstand with a brass tap and a basin, a hanging cupboard for clothes, a reading lamp on the bulkhead, and a bell push beside the bed for summoning the steward. The walls are panelled in mahogany inlaid with maple. The window has a heavy plush curtain in claret and a roller blind behind it. The lamp above the bed is a gas mantle in a brass fitting, with a globe of frosted glass that throws an even light over the bedclothes. The steward has turned it up halfway for your arrival. The whole compartment, lit at this level and against the cool dim of the train shed outside the window, is welcoming in a way that is unmistakable to anyone who has ever boarded an overnight train. You put your travelling bag on the rack above the bed. You take off your hat and your gloves and your coat and hang them on the hooks beside the door. The steward, having seen you settled, has gone back to greet the next passenger. You can hear other passengers boarding along the corridor. There is a man's voice, then a woman's, then the steward giving directions. There is the sound of a door being closed. There is the muffled whistle of an engine on the next platform setting off for somewhere else. You sit on the edge of the bed for a moment to take it in. The bed is comfortable. The mattress is firm in the way that railway mattresses had to be, made to absorb the running motion of a train rather than to cradle a sleeper into sinking. But the pillows are full, and the linen is fresh, and the eiderdown folded at the foot of the bed has a crisp newness about it that suggests it has been laundered today. There is a carafe of water on the washstand, and a tumbler upturned over its neck. There is a button beside the door that, when pressed, will summon the steward. There is, on a brass hook beside the bed, the long cord that connects to the communication chain running the length of the train, by which a passenger could in theory stop the train in an emergency, although the company had attached a stiff financial penalty for unjustified use of it. You get up. You step back out into the corridor. You walk the length of the carriage just to see the rest of it. There are 8 berths in coach 72. The corridor has a tall, narrow window on its outer side, looking down on the platform, and you can see the activity of the last few minutes before departure framed in each window as you pass a porter wheeling away an empty trolley, a guard speaking to the engine driver who has walked back along the platform with a torch, a woman in a fur-collared cloak being helped aboard by her steward 2 coaches down. The corridor is carpeted in a deep green, with the company's monogram woven in at intervals. The gas lamps on the corridor wall are turned down to a softer level than the lamps inside the berths. The whole carriage smells faintly of varnish and clean linen, and the warm, dry air of a vehicle whose heating system has been running since the train was prepared earlier this afternoon. You return to your berth. You sit again on the edge of the bed. You wait. The platform clock, visible through the corridor window when you stretch a little, reads 10 to 8. The departure is in 5 minutes. The train is now fully loaded. You can hear, faintly, through the open window of the corridor at the end of the carriage, the last shouts of the porters, and the last calls of the railway servants, and the brisk metallic announcements of the guard with his green flag walking the length of the platform. Then the door of your carriage closes. The vestibule between coaches gives a metallic clunk. There is a final shrill whistle from somewhere up the platform, the guard's whistle, the signal that the train is to start. There is, almost at the same instant, the answering whistle from the locomotive, deeper and more sustained. A great hooting note that fills the train shed for a long second, and then is drawn out into a falling tail as the engine moves. You feel the first lurch. The carriage shifts under you. The platform, framed in your compartment window, begins to glide away. You are off. The first lurch is one of those small mechanical events that the body remembers for years. The slack between the carriages takes up. There are perhaps 14 vehicles on the train, and each one connects to the next through a screw coupling and a buffer, and the slack in those connections has to take up in sequence as the engine begins to pull. So what your bed feels is a small forward jerk, then a half-second pause, then a slightly larger forward jerk as your carriage's couplings catch up, then the smooth pull as the whole train begins to move as a single thing. The brass fittings on the compartment shelf ring very faintly. The water in the carafe on the washstand sways once and settles. The reading lamp on the bulkhead, which is on a flexible brass mount, oscillates briefly and stills. You feel, against the small of your back where it rests on the seat back, the first sense of the train moving. The platform clock is sliding past the window. The lit windows of the great hall are sliding past the window. The lamps along the platform are sliding past faster and faster, and then they are gone, and the train is in the open cutting beyond the train shed, with the smoke of the engine rising up into the night sky above your compartment, and the lit windows of Camden Town just beginning to become visible high above the line. The first 100 yards of any train journey out of a great London terminus has a quality that no other part of the journey ever quite repeats. The carriage has not yet found its rhythm. The wheels are clicking over the points of the throat of the station, where the multitude of platform lines converges into the few outbound roads, and each click is a different note as the bogies cross a different rail. The brakes are still slightly on. The carriage is rocking laterally as it negotiates the curves of the points. The lit windows you pass on the platforms are still close enough to read the faces of the people standing at them. You have not really left. You are still, in some sense, inside Euston, even as Euston begins to release you. Then the points are crossed, and the engine takes hold of the train properly, and you feel the wheels settle onto a single straight road, and the carriage begins the long, shallow climb up Camden Bank that is the first work the locomotive has to do every time it leaves Euston for the north. Camden Bank is a rise of 1 in 70 for nearly a mile, climbing out of the cutting that the engineers had to dig in 1837 to bring the line into Euston without disturbing the houses of Camden Town above it. In the first decades of the railway, the gradient was too steep for the early locomotives, and the trains had been hauled up the bank by stationary cable engines housed in 2 great chimneyed buildings at the top of the climb. The cables had been removed in 1844 once the locomotives became powerful enough to manage the gradient under their own steam, but the engineering inheritance of those first years is still visible to anyone who looks for it. The depth of the cutting, the high retaining walls of brick on either side, the bridges high above your head where the streets of Camden cross the line. Tonight you are being pulled up the bank by a Webb compound passenger engine, one of the locomotives the company built in their own works at Crewe, with a crew of 2 men on the footplate who are working hard at this stage of the journey to get the long heavy train moving up the gradient. And you can hear, faintly through the carriage walls, the deeper note of the engine as it labours. The carriage windows show through the fogged glass the cutting walls passing on either side, then the bridges, one after another, throwing their dim shadows across your compartment as the train passes beneath them. Then the tops of the houses of Camden, lit windows here and there, families at supper, gas lamps in the streets above. Then the cutting opens out as the line crests the bank, and you are running through the goods yards of Camden, vast in the dim, with the long lines of standing wagons and the lit windows of the wagon shed offices and the shapes of locomotives at rest in the dark. The line flattens, the engine eases. The train begins to gather speed over the level out toward Primrose Hill. Primrose Hill itself rises to the south of the line as you pass it, a green dim hump against the lit haze of the city beyond, with 1 or 2 stars now visible above it in the deepening blue of the sky. The summer sky is still showing the last grey of the evening at this latitude in late July, and will continue to show that residual light, weakening as the train moves north, for nearly another hour. The carriage rocks comfortably. The wheels are clicking now in the long even rhythm of a train at running speed, the click of the rail joints coming under the wheels at intervals that begin to sound, after a few minutes, almost musical. You will hear that sound for the next 10 hours. It will be the constant background of the journey. By the time you have settled into your bed, it will already have become inaudible, the way the noise of the sea becomes inaudible to those who live by it. You stand up, you step out of your compartment into the corridor, you walk down the carriage to the vestibule at the far end, and you cross the connecting bridge into the next coach. The bridge has a leather concertina bellows around it, sealing the 2 carriages against the weather, and as you cross, you can feel the floor moving slightly under you, the carriages flexing against each other as the train rounds a curve. The bellows bridge is one of the engineering achievements of the era. Earlier trains had not had connecting corridors at all, and passengers had been confined to whichever carriage they had boarded for the duration of the journey, with no way of moving between them, and no access to a dining car or a lavatory. The Pullman Company, when it brought sleeping cars to England in 1873, had insisted on connecting corridors so that passengers could reach the dining and saloon cars, and the LNWR had built corridor stock for the night services within a few years. By 1888, the connecting corridor was standard on the express trains. The freedom it gave the passenger to walk the length of the train at running speed had become one of the unspoken pleasures of long-distance travel. You walk the corridor of the next coach. This is a regular first-class carriage, not a sleeper, with closed compartments instead of berths. You can see, through the corridor windows, the passengers in each one, a gentleman reading a newspaper, 2 ladies in conversation, a sleeping child laid out across his mother's lap, illuminated by their own gas lamps as the night runs past the window beyond them. The corridor smells of cigar smoke at the door of one of the smoking compartments. There is the muffled clack-clack of the wheels under the floor. The train is now running level and at speed, and you have to put your hand against the corridor wall as you walk to keep your balance against the slight roll of the carriage. You cross another vestibule. You enter the dining car. The first thing that meets you is the smell. The dining car at this stage of the evening smells of hot roast meat, of fresh bread, of butter melting on potatoes, of the burnt sugar warmth of the bread baskets, of red wine in glasses on white linen, of the faint cigar smoke drifting through from the smoking compartment a coach back, and underneath all of that, the metallic note of the gas lamps, and the coal-fired range somewhere ahead at the galley end. The second thing that meets you is the sound. The room is full but not loud. The murmur of perhaps a dozen conversations going at once. The chink of silver on china. The slight rocking ring of glasses against the rocking of the carriage. The regular click of the wheels under the floor sounding very faintly through the carpet. The third thing that meets you is the light. The brass-shaded reading lamps on each table throw a warm circle of light onto the white linen and the silver, and the gas mantles overhead provide a softer general illumination over the whole car, and the effect is the effect of any well-run dining room at evening, except that the room is moving and the country is dark outside the window. The dining car of the night sleeper to Scotland in 1888 was, by the standards of railway travel anywhere in the world, a remarkable thing. The first dining cars on a British train had run only 9 years before, in 1879, when the Great Northern Railway had introduced them on the East Coast route to Leeds and York. The LNWR had followed within 3 years. About 1888, the dining cars on the West Coast night service had been refined into something approaching the standard of a good London restaurant. The carriage tonight is 45 feet long and finished, like the Pullman sleepers, in mahogany and brass and varnished maple. The tables are arranged in twos along the central aisle, set with white linen and silverware, bearing the company's monogram, with a vase of fresh flowers on each table and a brass-shaded reading lamp lit on the bulkhead beside it. There are perhaps a dozen passengers already seated, dining at varying stages of the meal. There are 3 waiters in white jackets working the length of the car, 2 from the kitchen end, and 1 who attends the tables nearer the saloon. There is a faint smell of roast meat, and of the bread baskets that have been brought out warm from the galley. The carriage rocks comfortably as it runs, and the silver and the glass on the tables ring very faintly with the motion, in a music that no other dining room in the world produces. You are shown to a table. The waiter brings the printed menu. The menu is the regular night service bill of fare, 4 courses with a choice at each, printed in good copper plate on heavy card. There is an oxtail soup and a clear consommé. There is a roast saddle of mutton from the company's own farm at Wolverton, a fillet of beef in a Madeira sauce, a poached salmon from the Tweed, and a fricassee of chicken. There is a savoury course, a Welsh rarebit, a devil of kidneys, a bone marrow on toast, an anchovy paste. There is a dessert of cherries in brandy, or a charlotte russe, or a crystallized ginger. There is a short wine list, a claret, a hock, a champagne, a dry sherry. The prices are reasonable for what is being offered. The whole bill of fare has been refined over the previous decade by a long succession of company chefs in consultation with the directors of the Pullman Company, until it represents a reasonable consensus on what passengers travelling overnight at first-class fares should expect to find on their plates between London and Crewe. You order the soup, the salmon, the savoury, and a glass of the hock. The waiter takes the order. He is back within 4 minutes with the soup. The soup is hot and seasoned, and tastes of long-simmered beef and root vegetables. The bread is fresh. The hock is cold and cleanly dry. You eat without hurry. The window beside you shows the dim summer countryside passing outside. The train is now running through the country beyond Watford, with the woods of Hertfordshire dark against the paling sky and the lights of the villages flashing past at intervals. There is a station, lit and empty, that flashes through the window without the train pausing. There is the hooting whistle of the engine warning a level crossing somewhere ahead. There is the regular click of the wheels. The salmon arrives. It is poached in a court bouillon and served with a hollandaise that has been made in the carriage's galley, not 10 minutes before. There are buttered new potatoes beside it. The fish has the firmness and the flavour of a Tweed salmon that was alive in the river 2 days ago and has been brought down to London by the morning train and prepared by the company's chef this afternoon. You eat it slowly. The galley of the dining car, which you cannot see from your seat, is a working kitchen 10 feet by 6 fitted into the end of the carriage. The chef stands with his back braced against the bulkhead, the rocking of the train absorbed through his knees. The coal-fired range is hot in front of him. A copper saucepan of hollandaise is being whisked over a low flame, the steel whisk moving in a continuous figure eight that keeps the sauce moving even when the carriage takes a curve. The salmon is just out of the court bouillon on the side, the skin being lifted off with a wide knife. The bread for the next round of tables is in the warming oven on the right. The salt pork that will go into the breakfast hash is hanging in muslin from a hook in the corner. A second cook chops shallots at a board fixed to the working surface. A boy washes plates at the sink in a continuous stream. The dirty's coming in from the waiters. The clean's going back out. The boy's hands red from the hot water. The galley smells of stock and butter and steam and coal smoke and the faint kerosene of the trim on the gas lamps. It is a working kitchen producing a 4-course dinner for 30 diners on a vehicle moving at 50 miles an hour over imperfect track. And the chef has trained for this for 15 years. The man can plate a hollandaise on a rocking surface without losing a drop. The skill is considerable and entirely invisible to the diner at the table, who simply receives after 17 minutes a salmon in a yellow sauce that tastes of butter and lemon and was alive in the Tweed 2 days ago. The company's farms at Wolverton supplied much of the fresh produce for the dining cars. The LNWR had bought the agricultural estate at Wolverton in the 1840s when it built its carriage works there, and through the second half of the 19th century, the farms had been developed into a substantial agricultural operation, supplying meat and dairy and vegetables and eggs to the company's dining cars and to the kitchens of the major company hotels at Euston and Liverpool, at Street and the Great Northern Termini. The mutton you might have ordered tonight came from Wolverton. The butter on the table came from Wolverton. The eggs in the morning, early breakfast will come from Wolverton. The whole catering operation of the LNWR was, in this sense, vertically integrated as the most ambitious of the late Victorian companies sometimes integrated themselves, owning the production, the processing, and the distribution of their own food, as well as the trains on which it was served. You let yourself look around the carriage between mouthfuls. The other diners are a mixture of the kind you would expect on the night sleeper: a stout man in evening dress dining alone with a bottle of claret, a married couple a few tables further down talking quietly, a younger man with a moustache reading a book propped against the cruet stand, an elderly lady in widow's weeds being attended to with extra care by the waiter, who knew her from previous journeys. The carriage is a slice of late Victorian travelling society, gathered for 2 hours over dinner before each one returns to a separate berth, and the train carries them all together through the dark. The train, while you are eating, is running through the long, shallow valley of the Gade, and then crossing the watershed into the Bulbourne Valley, and then dropping into the tring cutting, which is the great engineering work of this part of the line. The tring cutting is 2.5 miles long, and at its deepest point is 57 feet below the original surface of the Chiltern Hills. For the 2.5 minutes the train is inside the cutting at this speed, the country outside the window stops being country and becomes a steep chalk slope on either side of the line, lit irregularly by the spill of the carriage windows, with the night sky reduced to a strip of darker dark above. The acoustic of the carriage changes. The sound of the wheels, which has been escaping into open country, now bounces off the cutting walls and comes back into the carriage with a different note, slightly fuller, slightly closer. The way the sound of a road changes inside a cutting on any railway anywhere. The waiters in the dining car compensate without noticing. You do the same. Then the cutting ends, the walls fall away, the sound opens out, and the train is in open country again on the descent toward Aylesbury. It was dug between 1834 and 1838 by Robert Stevenson's men, using nothing more than picks and shovels and gunpowder and horse-drawn tip wagons. And the spoil was carried out in such enormous quantities that it built up the embankments on either side of the cutting for miles. To stand at the lip of the cutting in 1838 had been to look down into a man-made canyon that was, at the time, one of the largest excavations of any kind in the world. Tonight you cross the cutting in your dining car at 50 miles an hour with a glass of hock in your hand, and the work of the Stevenson navvies is so completely absorbed into the landscape that you would have no way of knowing, from the carriage window, that you are passing through one of the great earthworks of the early Industrial Revolution. The savoury arrives. You have ordered the bone marrow on toast, which the company chef does well, and which goes admirably with the last of the hock. You eat it slowly. The marrow has been roasted in the bone and lifted out with a long, thin spoon by the waiter, who has spread it on the toast at your table in front of you, with a single grind of black pepper from a mill kept on the side service trolley, and a small wedge of lemon on the side of the plate. The fat of the marrow has melted into the toast and made it crisp underneath and soft on top. The taste is rich and faintly mineral, balanced by the bitterness of the toast and the dry edge of the last of the hock. It is a savoury of a kind that the late Victorian dining tradition perfected, neither sweet nor heavy, intended to close the mouth on a cleaner note than the main course alone would have left, and the company chef on the night sleeper does it as well as any club in London. The waiter clears the salmon plate and refills your wine glass. He asks if you will take coffee. You say you will. The coffee comes in a silver pot, with hot milk in a separate jug, and a dish of crystallized sugar. You sit with the coffee for some minutes watching the country pass outside, listening to the regular click of the wheels under the floor of the carriage, feeling the slight motion of the train against your shoulder where it rests on the upholstered back of the seat. The train passes Leighton Buzzard. The lights of the small town flash past in a tracery of gas lamps along the high street that you can see for a moment through a gap in the trees, and then not at all. There is a station that flashes through, lit and empty, with a porter just visible on the platform watching the express run through. There is the long sweep of the line down over the Vale of Aylesbury, where you can see, very faintly in the deepening dim, the dark shape of the Chilterns now receding behind you in the south. You finish your coffee. You ask the waiter for the bill. He brings it on a silver salver, with a brass pencil for signing. You add the gratuity. You sign your name. You stand up, unsteady against the running motion of the carriage, and you make your way back along the corridor toward your own coach. The walk back from the dining car to the sleeper, in the late stage of an evening dinner on a long-distance express, is one of the unsung pleasures of train travel that the Victorians had invented, and that again has been almost entirely lost in the transport of the modern era. You walk the carpeted corridors with the train running at speed beneath your feet, past the lit windows of the closed compartments, past the hatch where the waiters from the dining car are washing the dishes in their galley, past the smoking compartment where the gentleman in the evening dress is now established with a cigar and a glass of brandy. You can hear, faintly under the regular wheel noise, the deep working note of the engine at the head of the train, and you can hear the deeper hooting whistle as the engine warns the next signal box that the night sleeper is coming. You feel the train roll through a long curve, and you put your hand against the wall to balance, and you feel the warm, dry air of the heated corridor on your face, and you feel for a moment what it is to be inside a moving lit world that is being pulled through the dark by the work of men you have never seen. You pass, as you walk, the saloon car. The saloon car is the public space of the train, where passengers can sit in upholstered armchairs at small tables and read or write or converse for the hour or two between dinner and bedtime, and tonight it has perhaps a dozen passengers in it. There is the elderly lady from the dining car, now sitting with a book in a leather chair beside the lamp. There is a younger man with a writing case open in front of him on a table, evidently composing letters to be posted at crew. There are two gentlemen in evening dress at another table, deep in conversation over a bottle of port. There is a woman in a shawl reading a newspaper. The saloon car is, in its quiet way, the social centre of the night sleeper, and the passengers who use it are taking advantage of one of the more civilized features of long-distance railway travel, the ability to spend the evening in a comfortable public room while the country runs past outside before retiring to bed. The lamp in the elderly lady's corner throws a circle of warm yellow over her book and her face and the velvet of her chair. The pages of the book turn at regular intervals. She is reading a novel trollop, by the look of the marbled binding, which would be appropriate to her age and her style. The younger man with the writing case is writing in pencil, his hand braced against the rocking of the carriage, his face concentrated on the line he is composing. The two gentlemen with the port are leaning toward each other over the table to be heard over the wheel noise. One of them laughs at something the other has said. The laugh carries down the saloon, for a moment, then is absorbed back into the general hum. The woman in the shawl turns a page of her newspaper. The whole car has the atmosphere of a comfortable London club at evening, transposed onto a moving vehicle, and the passengers using it have, in many cases, paid the additional Pullman supplement partly for the privilege of spending the late evening in exactly such a room rather than alone in a closed compartment. You walk through it without stopping. You are tired. You want your berth. You return to your berth. The steward has been by while you were at dinner. The bedclothes have been turned down. The reading lamp has been lit at its lowest setting. There is a clean glass on the washstand and a silver tray on the bedside table, with a biscuit and a slice of orange, which the company provided to passengers in the night sleeper as a courtesy on long journeys. The compartment is now arranged for sleep. You undress. You hang your travelling clothes on the hooks. You wash your hands and face at the brass tap of the washstand with the clean cold water that the company has piped to every Pullman compartment from a tank above the carriage roof. You put on the night clothes you brought with you. You sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, brushing out your hair, and you can see, in the dim of the compartment with the reading lamp at its lowest, your own reflection in the dark window over the bed, and beyond your reflection, the unseen country of England passing in the night. It is now 9:20. The train has been running for an hour and a half. The dining cars will be served for another hour until the train reaches Stafford. After that, The dining car will be detached at Crewe for use on the morning trains, and the train that continues north will be a sleeping train only. The waiters will go to their own berths in a service car at the rear. The kitchen staff will close down the galley and go to their bunks. The first-class day passengers will retire to their compartments and sleep upright in their seats, as long-distance travellers had been doing since the railway began. The Pullman passengers will retire to their berths. The train will become quieter. The night will deepen. You get into bed. The sheets are clean and crisp. The eiderdown is heavy and warm as good railway eiderdowns were. The pillow is firm under your head. You pull the curtain over the window beside the bed, blocking out the lit reflections, leaving the compartment in the low warm dim of the reading lamp. You reach up and turn off the lamp. The compartment goes dark, except for the very faint glow of the gas mantle in the corridor outside, which will burn at low intensity all night. You lie back. You feel the bed beneath you and the carriage rocking and the rail joints clicking under the wheels, and the train moving through the country at 50 miles an hour, and the engine at the head of it pulling you north. The first few minutes of lying in a Pullman berth have their own character that the regular night sleeper passengers came to recognize. The body, having spent the day upright, lets itself down into the horizontal with a deeper kind of letting go than it manages in a stationary bed. Motion of the carriage which had registered against your standing balance now registers against the long line of your spine, and the small rolls and pitches of the train get absorbed by the mattress and the pillow rather than by your legs. There is a different gravity in a moving bed. The body recognizes it within minutes and begins to surrender to it. You can hear, very faintly, the steward moving along the corridor. He is making his rounds, checking that each berth has settled, that each passenger has the curtain and the lamp arranged. He passes your door without stopping. You hear the quiet footstep, the faint clink of his bell key against the leather of his belt, the slight whisper of his white jacket against the corridor panelling, and then he is gone toward the far end of the carriage. The corridor is quiet again. The gas mantle outside your door burns at its low setting. The carriage rocks. The wheels click. The train carries on north. You become aware, after another minute or two, of the regularity of the rail joints. The line in this stretch has been laid in standard 60-foot lengths, and the wheels of your carriage strike each joint with a click that comes at 55 miles an hour at intervals of about 3/4 of a second. The two bogies of the carriage strike the joints in succession, the leading bogie first, then a fraction of a second later the trailing one, so that what your ear receives is not a single click, but a kind of double click, a quick rhythmic pattern that repeats over and over with the regularity of a metronome. The body, lying on the mattress, begins to use the pattern as a pulse. The breathing slows to match it. The eyes close more easily. The mind, which had been holding the day, begins to release it. You are not asleep yet. You are in that state common to anyone who has lain down on a moving train, where the body is settling but the mind is still aware of what is happening, of the unfamiliar room, of the motion of the floor, of the regular sound of the wheels, of the dim and the warmth, and the strangeness of being in bed and travelling at the same time. You let yourself listen to the wheels. The click of the rail joints comes at intervals of about a second, depending on the speed and the length of the rails laid down at this stretch of the line. And the click is regular enough that the body begins, after a few minutes, to use it as a kind of pulse. You feel your breathing slowing to match it. You feel the carriage rocking very slightly against the suspension in a motion that is not quite gentle, but is regular enough to become reassuring. You feel against the back of your neck the firmness of the railway pillow. You feel against your body the weight of the eiderdown. You feel against the soles of your feet through the bedclothes the faint vibration of the running gear under the carriage floor. This is the state in which the sleeper passenger lies on the night train to Scotland at 9:30 on a July evening in 1888, while the train carries her north toward the country she has not yet seen and the morning that is coming. It is a state that the Victorians had invented. It had not existed before the railway. There had been no way, before this, for a person to lie down in a bed in London and wake up in the morning 400 miles away with their body rested and their clothes unrumpled and their mind clear. The night sleeper to Scotland was the first form of human travel that allowed sleep itself to be the means by which distance was crossed, and it produced, in those who used it, a new emotional state, the feeling of letting go of one geography and being delivered, while you sleep, into another. You let yourself begin to drift. The compartment is dark. The corridor beyond the door is dimly lit. The night is opening around you. The train carries on. The wheels click. The carriage rocks. The engine pulls. You are going to Glasgow in your sleep, and the train and the country and the night will deliver you there before breakfast. There are perhaps 36 Pullman berths over the 4 sleeping cars on tonight's train, and the steward will have shown each one of them to a passenger between 7:30 and 7:15 this evening. Among those passengers, if you walked the corridors at this hour and could see through the curtained doors into the compartments, you would find a representative slice of the people who had reason to travel between London and Glasgow overnight in the high summer of 1888. There would be a senior banker travelling north to inspect a Glasgow branch. There would be an engineer attached to one of the great Clyde shipyards, returning from a meeting with the Admiralty in Whitehall. There would be a barrister briefed for a case at the Court of Session in Edinburgh, who had taken the West Coast train as far as Carlisle, would change there for the Edinburgh service. There would be the wife of a Scottish landowner returning from the London season, with her maid in a less expensive berth 2 carriages back. There would be a wool merchant from the borders who had been at a trade meeting in the city. There would be a young man who had just been articled to a Glasgow law firm and who was returning from his interview. There would be a member of Parliament for one of the western Scottish constituencies, going home for the parliamentary recess. There would be a clergyman on his way to a brother's funeral. There would be an elderly lady in widow's weeds, travelling alone, on her way to spend the autumn with married children in a Lanarkshire town. These are the kinds of people the night sleeper carried. The fares were not cheap. A Pullman berth from London to Glasgow in 1888 cost something in the order of £2.10, which was the better part of a working man's monthly wage, and the passengers therefore tended to be drawn from the comfortable professional and merchant classes rather than from the working population. But the passengers were not by any means exclusively the very rich. The genuinely rich travelled in their own private carriages, hired or owned, attached to whatever express train suited their plans. The Pullman public was the broad band of professional people who had legitimate business in both ends of the country, and who could afford comfort but who were not, in most cases, of the aristocracy. It was a working public, in a sense, a public that used the night sleeper because it allowed them to combine a working day in London with a working day in Glasgow, with a comfortable sleep in between, in a way that no other form of transport could offer. The ordinary first-class compartments further down the train held a different population. The passengers there had paid the regular West Coast first-class fare, which was about half what the Pullman fare cost, and they would sleep in their seats upright against the upholstered back of the compartment, perhaps with a travelling rug across their knees and a thin pillow against the partition. The second-class compartments held a still cheaper class of passenger, sleeping in less padded seats. The third-class compartments at the rear of the train, mainly used by working people travelling overnight for short stretches of the route, were populated with men in working clothes and women with cloth bags and children laid out across the wooden benches with their heads on their mothers' laps. The class system of the train was the class system of late Victorian Britain in concentrated form, with the population stratified by what they could pay, and the comfort of the journey calibrated accordingly. The night sleeper had its own folklore. The senior commercial men who used the route regularly knew the schedules and the engine sheds and the names of the senior drivers. They knew which Pullman cars rode best. The older cars built in Chicago, some of them said, were better engineered than the later British-built equivalents. Although the British carriages were finished to a higher standard, they knew which berths in each car were quietest. They knew the menu in the dining car well enough to order without consulting the printed bill. They knew the steward by name on the trains they used regularly. The night sleeper was, for the long-distance commercial traveller of late Victorian Britain, almost a second home, and the camaraderie of regular travellers was a real thing. There were men who had been using the West Coast night sleeper twice a week for 15 years, and who knew more about the route than any of the railway employees who served them, and who would remark on variations in the running time or the engine performance in the way that a regular customer of a London restaurant would remark on changes in the menu. There were also the famous travellers. The night sleeper to Scotland was used regularly by prime ministers, by senior politicians, by judges, by bishops, by industrialists, by writers, by artists, by actors. Mr. Gladstone had taken the West Coast night sleeper to Hawarden Castle, his home in Flintshire, on countless occasions during his long career. Mr. Disraeli had used it less often, having less business in the north, but had used it. Lord Salisbury, the present Prime Minister, used the train when business required. Mr. Henry Irving, the great actor-manager of the Lyceum Theatre, took the night sleeper when his company toured the major Scottish cities, as did the leading actors of his troupe, Ellen Terry, Bram Stoker, the whole supporting cast of his great Shakespearean productions. Mr. Arthur Conan Doyle, who was at this date a young Edinburgh-trained doctor practising in Southsea and beginning to publish the Sherlock Holmes stories, had crossed Britain by night sleeper many times in his student years. Mr. Robert Louis Stevenson had used the route in his lifetime, although by 1888 his health had taken him to milder climates and he was abroad. The poet Algernon Swinburne, the painter John Everett Millais, the historian Thomas Carlyle, the novelist George Eliot, all of them, in their various lives, had crossed Britain in the dark in a Pullman berth between London and one of the Scottish cities, and had written about it in their letters or their diaries or their published works. The night sleeper, in this sense, was woven into the cultural life of the country. It was the train that the educated public knew. It was the train that the writers wrote about. It was the train that when a Victorian novel needed to move a character between London and Edinburgh in a single night, became the unspoken means by which the movement was accomplished. The novels of the period are full of characters arriving in northern cities in the morning, having travelled overnight by train, with the assumption that the reader will know exactly how the journey was made. The night sleeper was in this background way one of the central facts of late Victorian literary geography. You are now part of that geography. You are lying in a Pullman berth on a West Coast night sleeper in 1888, in the imagined company of a cross-section of late Victorian travelling society. The men and women in the berths around you have their own reasons for being on the train tonight, their own destinations, their own lives that will resume tomorrow morning when they get off at Carlisle or Glasgow. You will not meet any of them. The night sleeper was not generally a place for socializing. Most passengers ate in the dining car alone or with their travelling companion and then retired to their berths and slept. But you are sharing the train with them, and the train is carrying you all together in the way that long-distance trains have always carried mixed populations of strangers in a temporary common condition. The line you are travelling tonight is the original. It is the first intercity railway in the world. It is the prototype on which every other long-distance line was modelled, and the company that runs it had built itself, by 1888, into the largest joint stock enterprise on earth. The London and North Western Railway, the LNWR, the Premier Line, as the company itself preferred to be known. The line out of Euston had begun life in 1837 as the London and Birmingham Railway, the first railway to enter London from anywhere outside it, the engineering achievement of Robert Stephenson, the son of George Stephenson, and the inheritor of the family genius for laying iron roads across difficult country. The Birmingham line had been completed in 1838, after 4 years of work that included the Tring cutting you crossed an hour ago, the Watford Tunnel, the Kilsby Tunnel further north, at the time the longest railway tunnel in the world, and the Great Viaduct over the Avon at Wolverton. The line had cost £5.5 million, which was an enormous sum in 1838, and which had nearly bankrupted the company before it earned a penny of revenue. But once the line opened, the receipts had exceeded every projection. Birmingham and London, which had been a journey of 2 days by stagecoach, were now connected in 5.5 hours. Letters could be exchanged between the two cities on the same day. Goods could move between them overnight. The northern manufacturing economy and the southern financial and political capital were, for the first time in history, in something resembling continuous communication, and the new line, more than any other single technical innovation, was responsible for it. In 1846, the London and Birmingham had merged with the Grand Junction Railway, which connected Birmingham to Liverpool and Manchester, and with the Manchester and Birmingham Railway to form the London and North Western. The merged company immediately became the largest railway in the country and one of the largest commercial enterprises of any kind in the world. In the years that followed, the LNWR extended its main line northward through Crewe and Preston and Lancaster to Carlisle, and from Carlisle in partnership with the Caledonian Railway across the border into Scotland and on to Glasgow and Edinburgh. By 1850, the West Coast route from London to Glasgow was complete. By 1860, it was running multiple expresses a day. By 1880, it had become the principal artery of business and political life between the English capital and Scotland. The company's headquarters were at Euston, in the offices behind the Great Hall you walked through earlier. The works where the company built its own locomotives were at Crewe, in Cheshire, where the village of Crewe had grown into a town of 40,000 people, almost entirely because of the railway. The carriage works were at Wolverton, where the company's farms also raised the meat and produce served on the trains. The company employed over 70,000 men by the late 1880s. It owned 2,000 miles of track. It ran nearly 5,000 trains a day. It was by every measure the largest joint stock company that had ever existed. and the West Coast Night Sleeper to Scotland was its flagship service. The locomotive at the head of your train tonight was built at Crewe Works in 1885. It is a Webb compound designed by Francis William Webb, the company's chief mechanical engineer, who had taken over the works in 1871 and who across the past 17 years had developed his own peculiar theories about how locomotive cylinders should be arranged. A compound locomotive uses high-pressure steam in one set of cylinders and then lets the same steam pass into a larger low-pressure cylinder before being exhausted, gaining additional work from the same volume of steam. Mr. Webb's compounds had been a subject of long argument among British locomotive engineers. Some thought them remarkable, others thought them needlessly complex. They had become the standard express engine on the West Coast night services, and they were what was hauling you north tonight. The driver was a man called Driver Robinson, who had worked for the company for 31 years, and who held one of the senior driving positions at the Camden engine shed. His fireman was a younger man called Fireman Carruthers. Between them tonight, they had to keep the engine working at the pressure for 10 hours of express running, with one engine change at Crewe and another at Carlisle, and they had to do it in the dark. On a route the senior man knew so completely that he could call out the names of the signal boxes by their order on the line without looking at his watch. Drivenson has the regulator, and Fireman Carruthers has the shovel, and between them, in a cab open to the night wind, they will hold the train to its scheduled timings until Crewe. That summer, the summer you are travelling through, was the summer of the race to the north. The West Coast Company has been racing the East Coast Company over these very rails for the past month, and the country has been watching, and the timings of the night services that the public could read in the newspapers each morning have been the subject of more conversation in the coffee houses of London and the gentlemen's clubs of Edinburgh than any other single piece of news in the pub. Night travel in the 18th century. On the same general route between London and Scotland had been the stagecoach. The fast mail coaches from London to Edinburgh and Glasgow had been running since 1786, when John Palmer's reform of the postal service had introduced regular overnight mails on the major routes, and by the end of the 18th century the timetabled mails were the fastest way of crossing Britain. They ran at perhaps 8 or 9 miles an hour on good roads, with horses changed every 10 miles at a coaching inn, and the journey from London to Glasgow took about 60 hours of continuous travel. The passenger had to sit upright in the coach for most of that time, with whatever rest could be snatched in a moving vehicle on the rough roads of the period. There were halts at the principal inns for meals and for the changing of horses, but the coach moved by night as well as by day, and a passenger who took the through service from London to Glasgow would have had perhaps 2 nights of broken sleep, sitting up in his seat before he arrived. The journey was exhausting, the journey was expensive, the journey was uncomfortable, and the journey was, by the standards of any earlier century, almost miraculously fast. Before the mail coaches, the journey had taken longer. The postboys riding with the mail bags in the 17th century had taken 8 or 9 days from London to Edinburgh. The merchants and travellers who went by less urgent means had taken 2 or 3 weeks. The Romans, who had built the original road network, had moved at the speed of a marching legion, perhaps 15 miles a day, and a journey from Londinium to Eboracum had taken a fortnight at the least. For most of human history in Britain, the 400-mile journey from the south to the north of the country had been a serious undertaking that consumed weeks of a person's life, and that was attempted only when the reasons were sufficient. What the night sleeper had done in 1888 was to compress that journey into a single overnight session in a comfortable bed. The compression was almost beyond what the imagination could absorb when you compared the experience to what had gone before. A merchant in 1788 making the same journey would have left London in late summer, taken 2 months to reach Glasgow and conduct his business and return, and would have lost perhaps a stone in body weight from the rigours of the road. A merchant in 1888 left Euston after dinner on Monday and was back in his London office by Wednesday morning. The intervening time he had spent largely asleep, in a bed cleaner than the one in his own house. The economic value of the night sleeper to the late Victorian commercial economy was, in this sense, enormous, and the businessmen who used it knew it. It was also one of the great democratic achievements of the period, in a quiet way. The journey from London to Scotland, which had been the privilege of the wealthy or the exceptionally determined throughout most of British history, had become accessible to anyone with the price of a third-class ticket. A working family in 1888 could afford the fare from London to Glasgow at third-class rates if they planned for it, in a way that a working family in 1788 could not. The third-class passengers slept upright in wooden-seated compartments rather than in Pullman berths, but they got there overnight nonetheless, and they got there at a cost that was within the reach of ordinary working people. The whole population had been brought into the railway age, and the night sleeper in its various classes was one of the most visible expressions of that. The race to the north, when it came, was therefore a kind of late Victorian dramatic play within an institution that had already become quietly central to British life. The story of the race to the north begins, in a sense, with a long-standing rivalry between the two great trunk routes from London to Scotland. The West Coast route runs out of Euston, up through Rugby and Crewe and Preston and Carlisle, and into Scotland through Beatock and Lockerbie and Motherwell to Glasgow. The East Coast route runs out of King's Cross, up through Peterborough and Doncaster and York and Newcastle and Berwick, and into Scotland by the coast through Dunbar to Edinburgh. The two routes are roughly the same length. The West Coast is 400 miles to Glasgow, the East Coast 400 miles to Edinburgh, and they had, since the 1850s, been competing for the lucrative business of long-distance passenger traffic. Both companies ran daytime expresses to Scotland, both ran overnight sleepers, and both had been gradually improving their services across the past 3 decades. But until the summer of 1888, neither company had attempted to advertise its journey time aggressively. There had been a kind of unspoken truce. Both companies advertised their daytime expresses at 10 hours from London, and neither tried to undercut the other. The night sleepers had similar timings. The arrangement had been comfortable, the customers had been satisfied, and the two companies had divided the Scottish traffic between them along geographic lines, the West Coast for Glasgow and the Western Highlands, the East Coast for Edinburgh, and the East Coast of Scotland. The truce broke in June 1888. The East Coast Company, in a piece of competitive aggression that startled the railway world, announced that it was cutting the daytime journey time from London to Edinburgh from 10 hours to 9 by accelerating the schedule and by reducing the number of stops. The West Coast Company, taking this as a direct challenge, responded by accelerating its daytime express to Glasgow. The East Coast cut its time again. The West Coast cut again. By the end of June, the West Coast had brought its London to Glasgow time down to 9 hours flat. By the middle of July, the East Coast had brought London to Edinburgh down to 8 hours and 40 minutes. By the end of July, the West Coast had brought London to Glasgow down to 8.5 hours, and the country was reading the daily timings in the morning newspapers and laying wagers in the clubs on which company would crack first. The race, while it was occurring, was both exhilarating and faintly alarming to anyone who knew anything about railway operation. The schedules were being cut by the simple expedient of running the trains faster between stops with shorter dwell times at the stations, and a reduction in the number of stops themselves. There were no significant improvements in the engines, or the track, or the signalling. The men and the machines were simply being asked to perform at a higher level. The drivers were being given timings that left almost no margin. The firemen were having to maintain higher boiler pressure for longer stretches. The signalmen were having to clear the road earlier. The whole system was being run, by the high summer of 1888, at something close to the maximum it could safely sustain. Tonight, on the night sleeper to Glasgow, you are not strictly part of the racing. The day expresses are the racers, the 10 o'clock from Euston and the 10 o'clock from King's Cross, both of them flying north through the daylight hours with their crowded compartments full of businessmen and politicians and journalists watching the milestones tick past. The night sleeper has its own separate schedule, but the night sleeper on the West Coast tonight is being driven by the same crews who are running the day expresses, and the engine you are riding behind has been chosen because it is one of the fastest in the company's stable, and driver Robinson knows that the timekeeping he produces tonight will be discussed in the locomotive shed tomorrow alongside the timings of the day train. There is a competitive tension, even in your bed, as the train climbs out of the Vale of Aylesbury and gathers speed across the Bedfordshire plain. The race itself, by the way, will end 6 weeks from now, in the second week of August, when the directors of the two companies will meet in London at the Reform Club and agree to a gentleman's truce. The exhausting pace cannot be sustained without serious risk to safety. There has been one minor derailment near Doncaster on the east coast, a near miss on the west coast at Wigan. The newspapers, having celebrated the race for 2 months, are beginning to write articles asking whether public safety is being put at risk for the sake of competitive prestige. The directors agree to fix the daytime journey time to Glasgow and Edinburgh at 8 3/4 hours, slightly slower than the fastest racing times, and to abandon further competition on speed alone. The night sleepers will continue at their existing schedule. The race will be remembered by the railway historians who write about it later as one of the most exciting episodes in the history of British railway competition, but also as a moment when the country had nearly pushed its railway system past what it could safely do. The newspapers through the summer of 1888 had been carrying daily reports on the racing in their morning editions, with the previous day's running times for both routes printed alongside the football results and the cricket scores, and the public following the contest with the kind of attention that they would later give to a national sporting event. There were jokes in Punch about it. There were leaders in the Times. There were popular ballads about it being sung in the music halls of London and Glasgow and Edinburgh. The race had become, briefly, the principal piece of national entertainment, and the West Coast and East Coast trains had become, in the imagination of the country, almost living characters in a serial drama, with the drivers and firemen as the heroes of the piece. Driver Robinson, who has just brought your train as far as Crewe, has had his name printed in the morning papers more than once over the past month, and is recognised in the streets of Camden, where he lives, by neighbours who know that he has been at the controls of some of the fastest runs of the racing year. And the train has continued its work while you have been lying there. It has run through Bletchley, through Wolverton, with its great carriage works lit up beside the line. It has run through Road and Blisworth, and the long climb of the Northamptonshire uplands. The country outside the curtained window of your berth has flattened, then risen, then flattened again. The villages that pass in the dark are now showing only 1 or 2 lit windows each. The country families have gone to bed, and only the occasional cottage of a railway worker or an innkeeper or a doctor still has a lamp burning. The train sweeps through the silent dark of the late summer night with the steady forward motion that the body, lying in bed, has now begun to interpret as the natural condition of the world. To be still is no longer the natural condition. To be moving is you are not yet asleep, but you are no longer fully awake. You are in the long pleasant interval between where the body is settled and the mind is releasing its hold, and the wheels are clicking, and the carriage is rocking, and the engine far ahead is working its long way through the dark. Far ahead of where you are lying, at the front of the train, the cab of the locomotive is hot and open and loud. The wind tears through it at 50 miles an hour. The firebox door swings open every 2 minutes and throws a wash of orange light over the 2 men working there, then bangs shut and leaves them in the dim glow of the gauge lamps. Driver Robinson stands on the right side, hand on the regulator, eyes on the road. Fireman Carruthers stands on the left, shovel in hand, watching the gauge glass and the pressure dial and the back of the firebox he has just fed. The cab has only a partial canopy overhead and no proper protection from the wind or rain or coal smoke. The heat of the firebox makes the leeward side almost unbearable when the door is open. The wind keeps the windward side cool even in July. Driver Robinson, between signal sightings, watches the road ahead. Every curve and gradient and lit signal arm memorized over 31 years, the green and white and red points of light a quarter of a mile ahead picked out against the black of the country, the decisions about regulator and brake taken on what he sees through his own smoke. He has been at this job longer than Fireman Carruthers has been alive. Fireman Carruthers lifts another shovelful from the tender behind him and throws it through the firebox door. He will lift 4 tons of coal between London and Crewe, 100 weight every 5 or 6 minutes, the shovel placing each load on the part of the grate where the fire has thinned. His face is already smoke-blackened. The cloth round his neck is wet with sweat and coal dust. His shoulders ache from the lifting. He has a calloused right hand from the shovel handle. His grandfather was a navvy on the Liverpool and Manchester in the 1830s. That was retired from the Crewe works. And the railway is the family trade that has lifted 3 generations out of agricultural labour into a working life of skill and a regular wage. The 2 men will be relieved at Crewe by another crew, who will take the train the next stretch to Carlisle. They will be home with their wives and children before noon tomorrow. Your journey tonight is the trip they did on the night of the 25th of July, one of perhaps 300 trips they will do in the year, and they will not see you, and you will not see them. And your bed and their shovels are joined for 10 hours by the iron of the rails and the hot steam in the cylinders. You sleep on it. You drift now for a while. You are not yet asleep, but you are no longer thinking in the deliberate way that being awake requires. You are inside the long, shallow zone of beginning sleep, where the wheels click and the carriage rocks, and the dim of the corridor outside your curtained door seeps into the awareness, only as a faint regular reminder that the train is still moving, that the night is still going on, that the country is still passing in the dark beyond the curtain. The train is now running through the long Northamptonshire and Warwickshire stretches of the route. The country has turned to undulating farmland with hedgerows and stands of trees, and the dim shapes of villages settled into their valleys for the night. The lights you can see, When you turn over and lift the corner of the curtain, a very few a farm lantern here and there, a station master's lit window in a wayside halt, the lit signal box at every junction. The train has been running for 2 hours now. It has covered nearly 100 miles. The body, on a moving bed, has lost its sense of distance. You could be anywhere. There is an hour and a half between London and Crewe, in either direction, where the line runs through the most level country of the route, and where the engine works at the most economical pressure of the entire journey. The driver is happy here. The fireman is happier than he will be on the climbs further north. The train runs at a good steady 55 miles an hour, taking the curves at full speed, because there are no significant curves to negotiate, and the only break in the rhythm is the regular hooting whistle, as the engine warns the next signal box of its approach. The whistle, when it comes a mile ahead and warns the box that the express is on its way, is also the warning to the sleeping town the box stands beside. The whistle floats out across the dark country, audible in a farmhouse 2 fields away, audible in the upstairs bedroom of a vicarage, audible in the lit kitchen of the all-night baker on the village high street. The country people know the timings. They know that the night express is the 10:30 train from Euston that flies through their town at midnight, and they have come to use it as a kind of clock. The baker, who has been at his ovens since 11 and will be there until 5, hears the whistle and knows it is 12. The farmer's wife, who is up with a sick child, hears the whistle and knows it is 12. The night watchman at the gasworks 2 miles down the line hears the whistle and knows it is 12. The express does not stop. The express is for other people, for travellers between distant cities, for the kind of life that the village does not lead. But the express passes the village every night at 12, and the village notes the passing, and the whistle is part of the texture of the country. The train flashes through Road Station at 12 minutes past 12. Road is a Northamptonshire village of perhaps 1,500 souls, with a parish church and a market square and a single inn, and the railway station at the southern end of the village where the line cuts through. There is no scheduled stop. The platform clock reads what it reads, lit by a single oil lamp. There is a porter on duty for the night, an older man named Mr. Hibbert, who has been the senior porter at Road for 22 years, and who is sitting in the station master's office with a cup of tea reading yesterday's Daily Telegraph. He has heard the express coming a long way off. He stands when the headlamp comes into view. He walks out onto the platform with his lantern, and stands at the platform edge as the train passes him at full speed, the lit windows flashing past his face in a single long streak of yellow, the rush of air pulling at his coat. He raises the lantern in salute to the engine driver, although the engine driver cannot see him at this speed. Then the brake van is passed. The lit red lamp at the rear of the train recedes north. The wind drops. The platform is dim and empty again. Mr. Hibbert goes back into the office. He picks up the newspaper where he left off. The express will not be back through until tomorrow night. The lit windows of the signal boxes are passing on either side of the train tonight at intervals of about a mile or a mile, a half, and inside each one a single man is at work in the long quiet between trains. The box is a wooden building elevated on brick piers beside the line, its windows running its full length, lit from within by an oil lamp turned to its middle setting. Along one wall stands a frame of 30 or 40 long iron levers, red for stop signals, yellow for distance, black for points, blue for the locking levers that make it physically impossible to set up a route that would put 2 trains on one piece of track. The interlocking is a mechanical invention of the 1850s, patented by a man called John Saxby on the LNWR, and the levers will not move into the wrong combination no matter how hard the signalman pulls. It is the great safety achievement of the British Railway, and it is the reason the trains can run at 50 miles an hour through the dark. The signalman tonight is at his desk beside the stove, ledger open in front of him. The bell on his block instrument rings 4 times. The code for an express passenger train, sent down the telegraph wire from the next box south. He rings 4 back, granting permission. He pulls his levers in sequence, distant home starter, and stands at the window. He hears your train before he sees it, the deep working note of the engine carrying through the night air a long way ahead. Then the headlamp comes into view, then the lit windows of the carriages, then the train passes him at full speed with the regular click of wheels on rail joints, and is gone. He rings the bell to the box ahead. You are coming. He rings the bell back to the box behind him. You are clear of him. He notes the time and the engine number in his ledger. He sits back down. He waits for the next bell. 80 men along the line tonight will do this for you, scattered through 400 miles of country. Each one alone in his lit box for an 8-hour shift. They will hand you forward, box by box, from south to north, and they will not see your face and will not know your name. The bell signals carry their own grammar, given at varying speeds and rhythms, so that an experienced signalman can tell who is on the other end of the wire by the way the bell is rung, and the 80 men along the line are a community talking to each other across the dark by bell and telegraph. With your train passing along the conversation 3 carriages ahead of your berth, the travelling post office is fully lit and fully working. The carriage has the broad red band along its side and Royal Mail painted in white above the door, and inside are 6 men in post office uniform, sorting letters at speed at long benches under gas lamps. The mail bags loaded at Euston have been opened. The letters are being tipped into receiving trays. The senior sorter calls out the categories Crewe, Preston, Lancaster, Carlisle, Lockerbie, Motherwell, Glasgow Central, the Glasgow districts north and west and south, and the men at the benches drop each letter into its correct pigeonhole. A skilled sorter handling perhaps 2,000 an hour, recognising the address at a glance. The carriage rocks. The pigeonholes shake slightly. The sorters compensate without noticing, the muscle memory of 15 years on this run, having made the job automatic. The carriage has its own apparatus for picking up and dropping off mail without the train stopping. A leather pouch hung on a trackside arm at a wayside station can be caught by a net mounted on the side of the postal carriage as the train runs past at 50 miles an hour, and a pouch flung from inside the carriage into a trackside net can deliver mail to the station without slowing. The exchange happens in the dark, the 2 pouches passing each other in the air at the moment of the exchange, the sorters processing the new mail minutes after the catch. The letters being sorted 3 coaches ahead of you will arrive in Glasgow by the same train that delivers you, and they will be on the breakfast tables of the city before you have ordered your coffee. The country outside is changing as you approach Crewe. The lit signal gantries become more frequent. The line widens. The dim shapes of locomotive sheds come into view to the east. Crewe was a hamlet of a few cottages in 1840, with a public house and a parish church, and the home of the family from which it took its name, and almost nothing else. The Grand Junction Railway chose the site as the place where the line from Liverpool and Manchester to London would meet the proposed line to Chester and Holyhead, and the locomotive works followed in 1843 in a single shed beside the new station. By 1888, the works employ 7,000 men and cover 100 acres on either side of the line. The town of Crewe had grown around the works and the station, with the regular discipline of a planned industrial settlement. The LNWR had built rows of workers' cottages, schools, churches, a mechanics institute, a public bathhouse, a hospital, a market hall, and the great town hall on Earl Street that served as the civic centre of a community whose existence depended entirely on the company. The streets had names like Locomotive Terrace and Crewe Works Cottages and Engineers Place, and the population was overwhelmingly composed of railway workers and their families. Children born in Crewe in 1888 would in most cases grow up to work for the LNWR. Their fathers had done so. Their grandfathers, in some cases, had been among the first generation of works employees 40 years before. The town was a railway town in the most concentrated sense of the term, and the bell that rang out across its streets at 6 a.m. to summon the work shift was in effect the regulating clock of the entire community's daily life. The locomotive works themselves were, by 1888, among the most advanced pieces of industrial production in the world. Crewe Works built engines from the raw iron upward. The forge produced wrought iron components. The foundry cast iron and brass. The boiler shop assembled the great cylindrical pressure vessels that gave each locomotive its working steam. The machine shop turned the wheels and bored the cylinders. The erecting shop assembled the finished engines from their hundreds of components. The works produced an average of 3 new locomotives a week through the year, plus the repairs and the rebuildings of older engines that were sent in from across the LNWR system. The locomotive that hauled your train tonight was built here. The next locomotive that will haul the train onward from Crewe was built here. Almost every engine you will ride on any West Coast train of any kind, was built in this enormous works in a Cheshire town that did not exist before the railway invented it. The works run a night shift, and as your train approaches Crewe tonight, you will see the gas lamps of the erecting shop still burning over the figures of the night shift fitters working on engines undergoing repair. There are perhaps 200 men on the night shift scattered through the various departments. They will work through to 7 a.m. when the day shift takes over. The works runs 3 shifts a day, 6 days a week, with Sunday off. The output of new engines and repaired engines is therefore continuous. The LNWR's locomotive fleet is being constantly renewed and maintained by the unceasing labour of the Crewe workforce. The town and the works together produced by the late 1880s. A particular kind of late Victorian community that has since become almost mythological in British social history. The Crewe railway man was a known type, skilled, sober, chapel-going, often politically liberal, often a member of his trade union, often involved in some form of self-improvement society or working men's institute, often the holder of an allotment garden, where he grew vegetables in the long summer evenings, often the father of children, who would themselves enter the works at 14. The wife of a Crewe railway man was a known type too, the keeper of a clean cottage, the manager of a tight household budget, the woman who took in washing or sewing to supplement the family income, the church-going matron who held the moral framework of the family together while the husband was at the works. The Crewe railway family was one of the central social inventions of the late 19th century. It was the family that the railway company had built, and that had, in turn, built the railway company. And it was the family that, more than any other, defined the late Victorian working-class culture of skilled industrial labour in the north of England. The train passes through Stafford. The Stafford station clock reads 12 minutes past 11. The dining car has been closed and locked. The waiters have retired to their service car. The platform at Stafford is dim and quiet, with one porter on duty and a single lit lamp at the station master's office, and the train sweeps through without pausing. There are no passengers boarding the night sleeper at Stafford tonight. The train is now running at full express speed for the last stretch into Crewe. Crewe was the great junction of the West Coast route, the place where the line from London divided into the route to Liverpool, the route to Manchester, the route to Holyhead and the Irish Mail, and the route to Carlisle and the North. Crewe was also, since 1843, the location of the LNWR's main locomotive works, where the company had built thousands of engines for its own use and for sale to other railways across the world. By 1888, Crewe Works employed 7,000 men, and the town of Crewe had grown from a hamlet of a few cottages in 1840 to a community of 40,000 souls, of whom almost every working adult depended in some way on the railway. The train approaches Crewe from the south just before midnight. A great signal gantry at the southern approach to the station, with its dozens of arms and lamps, comes into view first, then the lit windows of the station itself, then the platforms, then the long sheds of the locomotive works visible to the east of the line, with their gas lamps still burning over the night shift of fitters who are working on engines undergoing repair. The train slows. The wheels click into the long curves of the station throat, where the dozens of converging tracks twist and rejoin. The carriage that has been running steadily for 3 hours begins to pull against itself slightly as the brakes take hold, and you feel, for the first time since the train left Camden, the carriage decelerating beneath you. You may, depending on whether you are sleeping deeply or only drifting, be aware of the slowing. The motion that has become the natural condition of the world is, for the first time tonight, changing. Some passengers wake briefly at this point, some sleep through. The arrival at Crewe is the only major engine change of the journey south of the border, and the train will stand at the platform for nearly 15 minutes while the web compound that has brought you from London is uncoupled and replaced with another engine of the same class, fresh from the Crewe shed, that will haul the train onward to Carlisle. Some passengers also leave the train at Crewe having business in the northwest, and other passengers board for the journey on to Scotland. The dining and service cars are detached. The travelling post office is detached briefly to be reloaded with the regional mail bags from the northwestern counties, then reattached. There is, in short, a complicated piece of choreography going on at Crewe between midnight and 1:15, with porters and shunters and engine crews and station staff all coordinating to turn the train around and send it onward. Through the curtained window of your berth you can hear, faintly, the sounds of the station. A whistle, a clank of buffers as a coach is shunted, the hiss of steam from the new engine being coupled on, the voices of railway servants on the platform, a bell from one of the trackside instruments, the deeper bass of a freight train passing through on a different line, the whole complicated industrial life of a great northern junction at midnight going about its work while you lie in bed. If you were to lift the corner of the curtain at this moment, you would see Crewe Station from the inside of a Pullman berth in the small hours. The platform is lit and busy. There are porters moving along it with luggage trolleys. There are railway servants in long coats checking the carriages. There is the engine that has just brought you from London being uncoupled at the head of the train, its driver leaning out of the cab to wave a hand at the shunter, its fireman climbing down with his tin can to fetch the men's tea, while the replacement crew take over. There is the replacement engine itself, a sister web compound just out of the engine shed. blowing off steam at a steady plume from its safety valve as it backs onto the train. There is a porter wheeling a basket of fresh mail bags toward the postal carriage. There is a guard checking the couplings. There is a station master in his frock coat and silk hat walking the length of the train with a lantern, looking at the wheel bearings, listening for hot axles. There are perhaps 80 railway men working on or around this train in the 15 minutes it stands at crew, all of them coordinating without speaking, each one knowing exactly what his part is in the choreography of turning a night express around at a great junction. You watch for a moment. You let the curtain fall. You close your eyes again. The carriage is warm and the bed is soft, and the work outside the window is not yours to do. The platform clock at crew reads 20 past midnight. A whistle blows. The carriage gives a lurch as the new engine takes the strain. The train moves. The lit platform begins to slide backward past your window. The night journey resumes. You have been carried in your Pullman berth through the entire centre of England, from London through the Midlands to the Gateway of the North, and you have not had to do anything for it except lie still and breathe. You sleep. The hour after crew is the deep middle of the journey. The train has settled into the long northbound run that will take it across Cheshire and Lancashire and Westmoreland to the Scottish border. The country it crosses in this hour is the heart of industrial England, the potteries to the east, the cotton districts of South Lancashire to the west, the great manufacturing town of Manchester 10 miles off the line, but you do not see any of this. The train runs through it in the dark. The mills that you would see in daytime, with their tall chimneys and their long brick sheds and their pall of smoke hanging over the valleys, are visible tonight only as the occasional cluster of lit windows in some night shift building, or the orange glow of a foundry where the metal workers are casting through the small hours, or the lit headstock of a mine shaft where the colliery is hauling its night production to the surface. The country of England in 1888 was a country that worked through the night. The cotton mills had largely settled into single shift working by this period, but the iron foundries, the steel works, the chemical plants, the gasworks, the bakeries, the breweries, the docks at Liverpool and Birkenhead and Manchester, all had men on duty through the small hours, and the lit windows of those workplaces, scattered through the dark countryside, formed a kind of constellation of working light along which the night sleeper passed. The country was not asleep. The country was producing, even at midnight, the goods and the energy and the commerce that kept its larger economic life going. Your Pullman berth, with its sleeping passenger, was one of the few moments of pure rest in a landscape that, for the most part, was working. The men in those night shift workplaces, the puddlers in the iron foundries, the bakers at their ovens, the gaswork stokers, the brewery fermentation men, the dock watchmen, were doing work that was, in its own way, as essential to the late Victorian economy as the work of the railway men who were carrying you through their landscape. The bread that would be on London tables tomorrow morning was being mixed and proved and baked tonight. The newspapers that the breakfast tables of the country would read in a few hours were being printed tonight on the great rotary presses of Fleet Street. The gas that lit the streets of the cities was being produced tonight in the gasworks. The whole basic infrastructure of British daily life was being maintained, hour by hour, by night shift workers in scattered workplaces across the country, and the night sleeper passing through their landscape was one of the only pieces of that infrastructure that carried a sleeping cargo. The rest of it was wide awake. You passed Wigan with its lit colliery headstocks earlier. You will pass Preston soon, with its dim station hotel. You are passing now, In the long stretches between the major junctions, the cotton towns of East Lancashire, dim in the distance to the right of the line, with their occasional lit mill windows where the machinists are running through some piece of overnight work, and the lit chimneys of the bleach works at Walton le Dale, the country flows past in a continuous lit and dark pattern, with the dim countryside punctuated at intervals by the lit windows of the night-working economy, and the train runs through it all without slowing, carrying you north. The train passes through Warrington. It passes through Wigan, where the lit headstocks of the great Lancashire collieries are visible to either side of the line clusters of orange and yellow light, marking the pits that have made Wigan the wealthiest mining town in the country. It crosses into Lancashire proper. It runs through Preston, where the principal station is dim and quiet at this hour, with 1 or 2 lit windows in the station hotel, and the platform master in his office reading a paper. It begins the long northward run across the flat country of the Field and the Lune Valley, with the dim shapes of the western Pennines visible to the east as a blacker mass against the night sky. You are by now in the deeper sleep that the body finds in the early hours, when the rocking of the train and the regular click of the wheels have ceased to be conscious sensations, and have become part of the substrate of the dreaming mind. You are not aware of Preston. You are not aware of the Field. You are not aware of the Pennines. You are not aware of the hour, or the speed, or the country, or the engine. You are, simply, asleep on a moving train, and the train is moving you, and the moving and the sleeping have merged into a single condition that the body has decided to accept. This was, by the way, the central technical achievement of the Pullman sleeping car as a design. The motion of a railway carriage at speed is not constant. It pitches and rolls and yaws against the suspension, and the rate at which it does so depends on the speed and the condition of the track and the weight distribution within the carriage. The Pullman engineers had spent years refining the suspension of their cars so that the motion at running speed would fall into a rhythm that the human body could accept as comfortable. They had increased the length of the carriages so that the longitudinal pitching was reduced. They had added supplementary springs so that the lateral roll was damped. They had positioned the bogies, the four-wheeled trucks at each end of the carriage that bore the weight, at a specific distance from the ends of the body so that the rotational moment around the centre of the carriage was minimized. The result was a vehicle that, at express speed on good track, produced a motion remarkably close to a cradle's rocking. The mind, lying in such a vehicle, would interpret the motion as soothing rather than disturbing, and would let go of consciousness more readily than the same mind would have done in a stationary bed. The Victorians did not know all of this in the technical detail that the Pullman engineers worked out, but they knew the result. They knew that they slept better on a Pullman than they did at home. They wrote about it in their diaries. They commented on it in letters. The night sleeper was, almost from its introduction, a thing that people remarked on as producing a particularly profound sleep, and the experience was one of the major reasons that passengers were prepared to pay the considerably higher fare for a Pullman berth than for a regular first-class compartment. The body knew it would rest better on a Pullman, and the mind followed the body. The dreams that passengers reported on the night sleeper had their own peculiar character, which the more reflective travellers sometimes wrote about. The motion of the train, working its way into the substrate of consciousness, often produced dreams of journeys, of walking through unfamiliar landscapes, of riding horses across open country, of being on ships at sea. The regular click of the wheels often produced dreams in which clocks were ticking, or in which footsteps were following, or in which a piece of music was being played at the same insistent rhythm. The faint warmth of the heated carriage and the closeness of the small compartment sometimes produced dreams of being indoors in winter, in childhood houses, in remembered rooms from years before. The traveller would wake at Crewe or at Carlisle or at Beatock, in the dim of the lit corridor, with the sense that he had been somewhere else entirely in the moments before the slowing of the train had pulled him back, and the somewhere else had often been a place from his own life that he had not consciously thought about for years. There was a literature growing through the late 19th century on the peculiar quality of railway sleep and railway dreams. Charles Dickens, who had travelled many times by night sleeper in the United States in the 1840s and again in the 1860s, had written about the strangeness of train sleep in his American notes and in his magazine pieces. Robert Louis Stevenson had written about it in his early travel essays. Henry James, the American novelist who lived in England by 1888 and travelled regularly by train, had described it in his letters. The consensus of the literary tradition was that train sleep produced an unusually vivid and an unusually associative kind of dreaming, that the railway carriage, with its movement and warmth and its enclosed dimness, became a kind of laboratory of the unconscious, and that travellers who slept on trains regularly developed a peculiar private collection of train dreams that recurred year after year on long journeys. You may, in your own sleep tonight, have such dreams. You may dream of childhood houses, of forgotten people, of journeys you have not actually made. The motion of the imagined train may carry you, in your imagination, into the country of your own memory. The wheels may ring out the rhythm of some half-remembered song. The country passing the window may become, in your dream, a country you knew once and have not visited for years. This is the way the sleeper carriage worked on the Victorian travellers who used it, and this is the way the imagined sleeper may work on you tonight. The train is now passing Lancaster. The lights of the city are visible briefly through the dim, the castle on its hill, the cathedral across the river, the lit windows of the riverside warehouses. Lancaster is the gateway to the northwest. Beyond Lancaster the line runs through Carnforth, where the branch to the Furness Peninsula joins the main route, and then it begins the long climb into the Lake District foothills. Shap is one of the great challenges of the West Coast route. The line crosses the watershed between the Lune Valley and the Eden Valley by means of a 10-mile climb of 1 in 75, followed by a similar descent on the northern side, and the gradient at Shap is the steepest sustained climb on any major British main line. Locomotives have to work hard to bring an express up Shap. Goods trains have to be assisted by banking engines pushing from the rear. The summit at Shap, 1,100 feet above sea level, is the highest point on the West Coast main line in England, and the wind at the summit, even on a calm summer night, is rarely still. The line crosses the open fells in this stretch with no shelter from the weather, and the men in the cab of the engine are exposed to whatever the night brings. Tonight, the night brings only a moderate westerly breeze and a clear summer sky. The driver and the fireman who relieved driver Robinson at Crewe are working their engine hard up the climb. The fireman has been shoveling almost continuously for the past 20 minutes, building up the fire to maintain the steam pressure. The driver has the regulator wide open and the reverser set for maximum cut-off, drawing the most power the engine can produce. The deep beat of the locomotive working hard up the gradient is audible in the carriages, even through the closed windows and the curtains, and the regular rhythm of the wheels has slowed slightly as the train labours against the slope. Ntuchengle. You may, in a half-conscious moment, register the change in the engine's note. Some sleepers do. Some pull aside the curtain and look out at the fells passing in the dim, with the white scars of limestone visible against the dark grass, and the moonlight catching the surface of a tarn somewhere in the middle distance. Some do not stir at all and sleep through Shap, as if it were level ground. Tonight the night is calm enough that the train climbs the bank without serious difficulty, although the engine works for it, and the summit is reached at 20 minutes to 2 in the morning. The train crests the rise. The note of the engine eases. The driver eases the regulator. The wheels, after the long climb, begin the long descent toward Penrith and the Eden Valley. The descent of Shap is one of the few places on the line where the driver has to work the brakes carefully. The gradient on the northern side is steep enough that an unbraked train would accelerate dangerously, and the driver has to apply the continuous brake at intervals to keep the train within safe limits. The brake on the LNWR was a vacuum brake controlled from the engine that applied through all the carriages simultaneously and held them at whatever level of retardation the driver selected. He works it now in light applications, holding the train back against the gradient, letting it run down the bank at a controlled 50 miles an hour. The fireman, having had his hardest stretch of the run on the climb, can now relax and watch the gauge as the engine no longer needs to be worked at full power. In your berth, what you feel is the bed tilting forward very slightly, the head end perhaps a quarter of an inch lower than the foot. The blood in the body shifts toward the head. The pillow takes a fraction more weight. The eiderdown wants to slide down the bed, although the cotton tucked in at the foot holds it. The wheels click faster than they did on the climb. The descent is being run at 50, though the gradient could let the train go faster, and there is, at intervals of perhaps a minute, slight tightening in the carriage as the driver applies the brake, then a release as he lets it off. The body in the bed registers each application as a small forward push against the pillow, then a release. The body absorbs both. The sleep continues. The train clears the descent. It passes through Penrith, where the signal box is lit and the night signalman watches your carriages run past. It enters the Eden Valley. The 10 miles between Penrith and Carlisle are a flat and easy run after the work of the climb, and the train recovers any time that may have been lost on Shap, settling back into its scheduled 50 miles an hour for the approach to the border city, Carlisle. Carlisle is the last station in England. The train arrives at Carlisle Citadel Station at 5 minutes past 2 in the morning. It will stand there for 10 minutes. While the LNWR engine is uncoupled, and a Caledonian Railway engine takes its place for the run-on into Scotland, the Caledonian was the LNWR's partner on the through service to Glasgow. The West Coast Joint Stock had been an agreement between the two companies since the 1850s, by which carriages and through services were run as a single operation across the border, with each company providing the locomotive power on its own metals. The change of engine at Carlisle was the operational consequence of that agreement. You may be aware of the stop. The Carlisle station is one of the larger interchanges on the route, and there is more activity outside the train than at the other intermediate stops. There are passengers leaving the train for Carlisle and the Scottish borders. There are railway staff walking the platform with lanterns. There are the calls of the porters and the brief whistles of the shunting engines. There is the change of engines themselves, the LNWR web compound being uncoupled and rolled away to the engine shed, and the Caledonian engine, a Drummond passenger engine, in the dark blue livery of the Scottish company, with the polished brass bell above the dome, being backed onto the train and coupled up. The whole process takes 10 minutes. The platform clock reads 2:15 when the new engine has the train, and the Caledonian guard has his green flag ready. If you lift the curtain at Carlisle, what you see is two countries meeting on a single platform. The LNWR engine being walked away to the shed is in the company's black with red lining and the great brass safety valve cover that the English company favoured. The Caledonian engine coming on is in the blue, with the polished brass bell and the lion rampant heraldic device of the Scottish company on the cab side. The men around the LNWR engine are in the LNWR's dark blue serge uniforms and the cloth caps with the company's lettering. The men around the Caledonian engine are in the Caledonian's different blue serge and different cloth caps with different lettering. The porters on the platform speak with the soft border accent of Carlisle, which is neither English nor Scottish, but something of its own. The station master, a man in a long frock coat and silk hat, walks the length of the train with a lantern and lifts his hat to the new Caledonian crew as they take over. The whole transition takes 10 minutes and is the visible operational consequence of an intercompany agreement signed 30 years before, by which the West Coast joint stock would be operated as a single through service across the border, with each company providing the locomotive power on its own metals. You watch it for as long as you are awake. You let the curtain fall. You close your eyes. The whistle of the new engine, when it sounds in the night air at Carlisle, has a different note from the LNWR engine you have been listening to all evening. It is higher in pitch. It is shorter in duration. It carries a different operational vocabulary. The Caledonian whistle is the sound of Scottish railways, and you will hear it now for the rest of the journey, as the train moves out of Carlisle and crosses, in the next 10 minutes, the border between England and Scotland. The border itself is unmarked from the train. There is no station at the line of demarcation. The train simply passes from one country to another in the middle of open country, somewhere between Carlisle and Gretna Green, with no announcement and no formal acknowledgement. You sleep through it. You will not know, in the morning, at exactly what minute the change occurred, but the change is real. You went to sleep in England. You will wake up in Scotland. The night sleeper has done that for you, in your bed, without your having to do anything for it. The political map has been redrawn around your sleeping body, and you have not even turned over. Throughout almost the whole of human history, the act of crossing a national border had been a piece of conscious experience. It had involved travel, often difficult travel, and it had involved the awareness of being in a foreign country with foreign customs and a foreign language and foreign authorities. To cross a border in your sleep, with no awareness, was a thing that the railway had made possible, and that the night sleeper had perfected. The Pullman compartment was, in a sense, a piece of London moving north, and you would inhabit it through the change of country without any visible alteration in your immediate world. The clean linen, the polished mahogany, the gas mantle, the regular click of the wheels, all of them carried with you across the border, unchanged. The English-Scottish border is, of course, a friendly border. There is no immigration check on the night sleeper. There is no customs inspection. The two countries had been in political union for nearly 200 years by 1888, and the train ran over the line with no more formality than across any other county boundary. The change is administrative. The railway company changes, the legal jurisdiction changes, the police authority changes, the language of the platform staff sometimes changes from English accented to Scottish accented English, but politically the border is invisible. The night sleeper showed what borders could be when they had been domesticated by union and by infrastructure. It showed that the experience of crossing a border could become almost nothing. This was, in its way, one of the proudest achievements of the late Victorian British state. The border between England and Scotland had been a place of war for nearly 1,000 years before the Union of 1707. The Roman wall along the Tyne, the medieval Reiver country, the great battles of Flodden and Bannockburn and Pinkie Cleugh, the long bitterness between the two crowns until the personal union of 1603 and the parliamentary union of 1707, all of that history stood behind the unmarked line that the night express crossed without acknowledgement in the small hours of a July night. The pacification of the border had been the work of 3 centuries. Its conversion into an invisible administrative line was the work of 2 more. By 1888, the border was so thoroughly absorbed into the unity of the British state that the train passed it, as casually as it passed a parish boundary, and the passenger sleeping through it had no reason to know that he had moved between kingdoms that had once fought each other to a standstill. There were Scots and English on this train tonight in roughly equal numbers, mingled together in their compartments without ceremony, and they did not feel that they were crossing into foreign territory or out of it. They felt that they were going home, or going to work, or going to visit relatives, in a country whose 2 ancient kingdoms had become so interwoven that their separateness was now mostly a matter of historical sentiment. The night sleeper was the practical demonstration of that interweaving. The seamless crossing of the border at 2:30 in the morning was a political fact about the British state at the height of its self-confidence. The Caledonian Railway was, in 1888, the largest railway in Scotland, with its main lines running from Carlisle to Glasgow Central, from Carlisle to Edinburgh, from Glasgow North to Stirling and Perth and Aberdeen, and from Glasgow West to Greenock and the Clyde steamer ports. The company was a generation younger than the LNWR. It had been incorporated in 1845, with its main line opening in 1848, and it had built itself, through the second half of the 19th century, into one of the great Scottish institutions. The Caledonians' headquarters were at Glasgow Central Station, the great terminus that you would arrive at in the morning. Its locomotive works were at St Rollox, north of Glasgow. The blue livery of its engines, with the brass bell above the dome and the company's coat of arms on the cab side, was one of the most recognisable in the British railway world. The driver who has taken the train at Carlisle is a Caledonian man named Driver Stewart, who has been on the Carlisle to Glasgow road for 15 years. He knows it the way Driver Robinson knew the London to Crewe road. His fireman is a young man called Fireman Cameron. They will work the train through to Glasgow over the next 3.5 hours, with the climb of Beatock to negotiate first, and then the long descent into the Clyde Valley. The work at Beatock will be at least as hard as the work at Shap, and possibly harder, because Beatock is a longer climb and a steeper one. The train pulls out of Carlisle at 2:15. It crosses the River Esk just north of the station. The Esk in the small hours of a July morning is a slow black river running between low banks, with the water reflecting the lamp on the trackside signal post as the train crosses the bridge. The bridge itself is a short 3-span iron girder, built in the 1850s, that the wheels of the carriage strike with a different note from the rail joints, a hollow drumming for the 2 or 3 seconds the train is over the water, then back to the regular click as the line returns to ballasted track. Anyone awake in their berth, if they had the curtain drawn, would hear the bridge under them and know without looking that the train had crossed something. The first time the night sleeper passenger crossed the Esk in this manner was the moment that England gave them up and Scotland received them, although the border lies a mile or 2 further north, and the actual transfer of jurisdiction happens at an unmarked point in the open fields between Gretna and Mosbanchucht. The train runs through Gretna Junction, where the line to Edinburgh diverges to the right and the line to Glasgow continues straight ahead. It enters Annandale and begins the climb into the southern uplands of Scotland. The train climbs, and the country it is climbing through has its own railway history. Scotland built its early lines on the same principles as England, with private joint stock companies promoting individual routes through the 1830s and 1840s. The first Scottish railway of any consequence was the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway, which opened in 1842 and connected the two great cities of the Central Belt with a 45-mile line through Falkirk. The Caledonian followed in 1848. The Glasgow and South Western Railway, which ran a competing route from Carlisle to Glasgow via Kilmarnock, opened in the early 1850s. The North British Railway, which served the eastern half of Scotland and ran the East Coast service from Berwick to Edinburgh and onward to Aberdeen, opened progressively across the 1840s and 1850s. The Highland Railway, which served the country north of Perth, opened in stages between 1855 and 1874. By the 1880s, Scotland was served by 5 major railway companies and a number of smaller ones, with a total mileage of around 3,000 miles of track and a passenger network that connected almost every town of any size to every other. The 3 main lines from England, the West Coast via Carlisle and Beatock, the East Coast via Berwick, and the Midland Railway's route over the Settle and Carlisle line that fed into the Glasgow and South Western, handled almost all the cross-border traffic between them. The night sleepers, the daytime expresses, the goods trains, the mail trains, the cattle trains, the migrant labour trains in the harvest season, all of them passed through one or other of these 3 border crossings. The Scottish railway companies had their own engineering traditions, their own architectural styles, their own peculiar approaches to operations. The Caledonian, which ran your train tonight north of Carlisle, was the most English of them in style. Its main line had been built by English contractors using mostly English engineering. Its first locomotives had been built in English works, and its running practice was closely modelled on the LNWR. The North British, by contrast, had a more independent character, with its own engineering at Cowlairs Works in Glasgow, and its own distinctive architectural style that drew on Scottish baronial models. The Glasgow and South Western had a lowland Scottish identity that was different again. The Highland Railway, which served the country beyond Perth, had a peculiar Highland character, with single-track main lines through enormous stretches of empty country and stations that were sometimes 30 miles apart. Tonight you are riding the Caledonian. The blue livery of the engine, the polished brass of the bell above the dome, the heraldic device of the company on the cab side, the lion rampant of Scotland with the company's monogram beneath, are all the visible signs of having entered Scottish railway territory, and the working practices of the Caledonian, although close to those of the LNWR, have their own subtleties. The whistle of the engine has the higher Caledonian pitch. The signal arms are slightly different in design. The point rod fittings have the Caledonian patent. The track gauge is the same, of course, Brunel's broad gauge in the southwest of England being the only significant exception in Britain to the standard 4 feet 8.5 inches, and Brunel's gauge having been suppressed by 1888, but the engineering details of the line you are riding have all been made by Scottish hands. The country the line passes through, between Carlisle and Glasgow, is the southern uplands of Scotland, the high moorland country that runs from the border to the central belt, with the Tweed and the Annan and the Clyde all rising from the same mass of hills. It is country that had been settled lightly over the centuries, with a population of perhaps 1,000 to the square mile in some valleys, and almost no population at all on the higher tops. The villages along the line, Lockerbie, Ecclefechan, Beatock, Crawford, Abington, are mostly market towns that grew up at the points where the medieval drove roads crossed the rivers, and that had been quietly transformed over the past 40 years by the arrival of the railway. The shepherds of the high country still drove their flocks down to the markets in the spring and the autumn, but they could now ride home by train in the evening. The local farms could send their wool and their meat to Glasgow or to England the same day. The world that had been a long day's walk world was by 1888 an hour by train world. Robert Burns, the great Scottish poet who had died in 1796, had lived for the last years of his life in Dumfries, 10 miles south of Lockerbie. He had been an exciseman in the late 1780s and the 1790s, riding his collecting rounds through the country that you are now passing through in your sleep. He had ridden it on horseback. The journey from Dumfries to Edinburgh, which he made several times in his lifetime to deal with publishers and friends, had taken him 2 days each way. The same journey on the Caledonian Railway in 1888 took 2.5 hours in a comfortable upholstered compartment, with the country passing the window. The compression of distance that the railway had brought to the Burns country was something the local people remarked on in their letters and their newspapers throughout the second half of the 19th century. They said that the world had become small. They said that places that had been remote were now close. They said that the old isolation of country life had ended. It had ended in one sense, and not in another. The country itself had not changed. The hills and the rivers and the fields were what they had always been, but the relationship of the country to the rest of Britain had changed. A farm in Annandale in 1888 was not, in any practical sense, isolated. The morning newspaper from London arrived by the early train. The post from anywhere in the British Isles arrived twice a day. A businessman in the village could take the early train to Glasgow and be back in time for supper. A young woman from the village could go to be a maidservant in London if she chose to, and could come back to visit her mother twice a year by night sleeper. The thread of the railway had been woven through the country, and the lives of the country people had been threaded onto it. The train climbs through Annandale. The country outside the curtained window is, although you cannot see it, country of low hills and farms, and the long dim shape of the Annan, running parallel to the line. The villages you are passing, Annan, Ecclefechan, Lockerbie, are sleeping under their few lit windows. The shepherds' cottages on the higher ground are dark. The shepherds are asleep in their iron beds with their lurchers at their feet. The train climbs steadily. Beatock. The climb at Beatock starts at Beatock Station, a small station in a Lanarkshire village, and rises 10 miles to Beatock Summit at an average gradient of 1 in 75. It is the steepest sustained climb on the West Coast route in Scotland, and one of the steepest on any main line in Britain. The summit is at 1,014 feet above sea level. The climb is carried mostly through open moorland, with sparse settlement, and few features apart from the occasional sheepfold and the lit window of a shepherd's cottage. The line runs alongside the Evan Water on the way up, and at the summit it crosses the watershed into the valley of the Clyde. The train begins the climb at 3:15 in the morning. The moon, if you were awake, would now be low in the western sky and beginning to set. There would be a faint paling of the sky in the east over the hills, the first pre-dawn light that would not yet have reached the ground, but that would have begun to wash out the brighter stars. You are not awake. The carriage rocks beneath you. The wheels click. The engine, beginning to work hard up the gradient, settles into the deep regular bark that locomotives produce when they are pulling a heavy train up a sustained slope. The driver and fireman are now in the hardest stretch of their entire turn. The fireman is shoveling almost continuously, lifting hundredweight after hundredweight of coal from the tender behind him and throwing it through the firebox door in front of him with the precision needed to maintain an even fire over the whole grate. The driver has the regulator wide open and the cutoff set for maximum power. The engine, at full output, is producing perhaps 1,500 horsepower at the wheel rim. The boiler pressure is being held at the working maximum of 170 pounds per square inch. The water level in the gauge glass is being maintained by the injector. The engine is doing everything it can, and the train is climbing at perhaps 30 miles an hour, half its normal speed, against the gradient. The cab of the engine is hot. The firebox door is open more often than closed during this stretch, and the heat from the fire is pouring into the cab on top of the men. Fireman Cameron's shirt under his serge overall is wet through. His shovel scrapes against the iron lip of the tender every 2 minutes as he draws another load, and the load goes through the firebox door with a steady underhand throw that places it on the back of the grate, then the next on the left wing, then the right, then the front, then back to the back, a rotation that he learned in his first year on the road and that he could do now in his sleep. The fire roars when the door is open. The orange light of it washes over the cab and over Cameron's blackened face and over driver Stewart's stripped forearms on the regulator. Stewart's eyes are stinging from the smoke that is, on this wind direction, blowing back into the cab. He is leaning out of the side of the cab to watch the road. The signal posts come up out of the dark a quarter of a mile ahead, the green and white points of light against the black moorland. He calls each one, clear, 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 as Cameron shovels. The work is hard. The work has been hard for 10 miles. The summit is still 2 miles away. What you hear, 200 yards behind them in the curtained dim of your berth, is only the deep regular bark of the labouring engine, slowed to the rhythm of the climb, and the faster click of the wheels as the engine takes each rail joint with a thump that says it is working for the speed it is making. You may turn over in your sleep. You may pull the eider down a little higher. You may dream of climbing a hill. The cab 200 yards ahead of you is roaring, and Cameron is shoveling, and Stewart is calling the signals, and the train is going up Beatock, and the only evidence of any of it that reaches your bed is a slight change in the engine note. You sleep through it. The train reaches Beatock summit at 12 minutes to 4. The driver eases the regulator. The engine, having worked at full output for nearly 20 minutes, can settle back to a more economical setting for the descent. The deep bark of the labouring engine is replaced by the lighter, quicker note of an engine running at speed without strain. The carriage, which has been climbing, begins to descend. The wheels click faster as the train picks up speed down the northern side of the watershed. The descent into the Clyde Valley is one of the longer downhill runs on the West Coast route. The line drops 30 miles from Beatock summit to Motherwell, with most of the descent at 1 in 100 or steeper. The driver has to work the brakes again in the same controlled way. He worked them coming down from Shap, holding the train back against the gradient and managing the speed at 50 miles an hour. The train passes Crawford, it passes Abington, it passes Symington, where the line to Edinburgh and the borders diverges. It enters Lanarkshire. The eastern sky by this time has begun to lighten. The first pale grey of the pre-dawn is now visible on the horizon, somewhere ahead and to the right of the train. The country outside the carriage window has, very faintly, become legible. The moorland and the sheepfolds and the dim shapes of the hills are now distinguishable in a way they were not an hour ago. The night is ending, although it is not yet morning. The train passes through Lockerbie. Lockerbie is a market town in Dumfriesshire that you will, in 100 years, learn to associate with a tragedy that has not yet happened, the Pan-American flight that will fall on the town in 1988, exactly a century from tonight, in a disaster that will mark the place forever in the public memory. But tonight Lockerbie is simply a sleeping border town, with 1 or 2 lit windows and the dim shape of its parish kirk against the paling sky, and the night sleeper passes through it without noticing it, as it has passed through 50 other small towns through the night. Beyond Lockerbie the country opens. The train runs through Beatock village itself, a railway settlement that exists almost entirely because of the locomotive depot at the foot of the climb, with its row of railwaymen's cottages and a single pub and its goods sheds and its station, and continues north through the gradually flattening country of the upper Clyde Valley. Beatock village is awake at this hour, even though the country around it is sleeping. The locomotive depot at the foot of the climb has its night shift on duty, with 2 banking engines kept in steam ready to be coupled to the rear of southbound goods trains that need help up Beatock from this side. The gas lamps of the engine shed are burning. There is a lit window in the depot foreman's office where the man on duty is writing up the night's running log. There is the orange glow of an open firebox somewhere inside the shed where a fitter is working on a cracked grate. There is steam rising from the safety valve of one of the banking engines, a long white plume into the paling sky. The row of railwaymen's cottages on the village street has perhaps 3 lit windows. A wife getting up to start the fire for a husband coming off the night shift, a baby being fed, an old man who has not slept well lighting a candle to read his Bible. The rest of the village is dark. The pub is locked. The kirk on the hill above the cottages is silhouetted against the eastern sky. The whole settlement, in the half-light of 4 in the morning in late July, has the quality of a place that lives by railway hours rather than by farming hours, and that is in some sense always partly awake, because the railway is always running, and the men who run it need to be fed and washed and woken and seen off by women whose own clocks have been adjusted to the timetables. 2 miles north of the village, in the signal box at Aachen Castle, the man on duty is having his 4th cup of tea of the shift. He is 62 years old, has been a signalman on the Caledonian for 38 years, and has worked the Aachen Castle box for the past 19. He knows the morning timetable by heart. He knows the night sleeper is due past him at 12 minutes to 4. He knows that on this particular wind direction, the engine note from the climb a Beatock carries to his box from a long way off, and that he will hear the train approaching for nearly 2 minutes before it actually passes his window. The bell on his block instrument has just rung 4. He has rung 4 back. He has pulled his levers. He stands at the window with a tin mug in his hand, watching the line south. The eastern sky is paling. The morning is starting to come. He hears the deep working note of the engine first, then sees the headlamp emerge from the dim. Then the train passes him at full speed and is gone. He rings the bell forward, rings the bell back, notes the time and the engine number in his ledger. He finishes the tea. He sits down. In another 2 hours he will be relieved. He will walk home down the lane to his cottage in the village, where his wife will have his breakfast ready and the kitchen will be warm. He will sleep through the day. He will come back to the box at 6 in the evening for the next shift. He has been doing this with small variations, every working week for 19 years. Your train sweeps through Betok village without slowing. The platform of Betok station is dim. The night porter on duty raises his lantern. The express is gone past him in 12 seconds. The lit red lamp on the brake van recedes into the dim toward Crawford. The porter goes back into his lit hut. The cottages of the village are settling back into the morning quiet. The banking engines wait in the depot for their next call. The Clyde, while you are passing through this stretch of its valley, is not yet the great industrial river it becomes downstream of Glasgow. Up here between the Lowther Hills and the city, the river is an upland stream running through pasture, with the occasional sheep farm beside it, and the dim shapes of the surrounding hills closing it in. The Clyde is one of the great Scottish rivers. It rises on the moors south of Crawford. It runs north past Lanark and over the famous falls there. It turns west at Bothwell and flows through the centre of Glasgow, and it widens at last into the deep estuary that has made the city the centre of Scottish shipping. But up here in its upper valley, it is still a hill stream, and the country it passes through is still upland country, and the sense of being deep in southern Scotland, far from the coast and far from the cities, is still strong. The villages of the Upper Clyde Valley, Crawford, Abington, Lamington, Symington, were the homes of farming families and of the men who worked the lead mines at Lead Hills and Wanlockhead in the hills above. Lead mining had been an important industry in this part of Scotland from the 17th century onward, and at its height in the late 18th century, the Lead Hills mines had produced a significant proportion of the lead used in British construction. By 1888 the industry had declined, but it was still active, and the trains on the West Coast Line carried lead ore down from the Clydesdale mines to the smelters in central Scotland and onward to the markets in England. The border country you have just crossed had been, for centuries before the railway came, the country of the border ballads, the great body of traditional verse that recorded the long centuries of feuding between the Scottish and English families along the borderline. The border ballads are some of the finest poetry in the English language, and they tell the stories of the reivers and the wardens and the lovers and the deaths of a country that, until the union of the crowns in 1603, was almost continuously at war with itself. The country has been at peace, in any active military sense, for nearly 300 years by 1888, but the ballads survive, and the place names along your route, Annandale, Eskdale, Liddesdale, Teviotdale, are the names of the great valleys that the ballads named. Sir Walter Scott had collected the ballads in the early 19th century, in a book called The Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, and his collection had brought the verse to a wide-reading public. Scott's own home at Abbotsford, in the central borders, was one of the more visited literary shrines of 19th century Britain. The country you have crossed in your sleep tonight is therefore country with a literary weight that the train passenger might not be aware of. Burns to the south of the line, Scott to the east, the long shadow of the ballads hanging over the whole region. Ground beneath the rails has stories. The hills outside the curtained window have ghosts. You sleep through it. The train delivers you across it. The country accepts the passing of the night express in the way that a long-settled country accepts whatever modernity sends through it, with the implicit understanding that the older layers of meaning are not displaced by the new ones, only added to. Motherwell. The train reaches Motherwell at 5:25. The sky is now properly grey. The lit windows of Motherwell, a town of 40,000 in 1888, dominated by its iron and steel works, with the great furnaces at Dalzell visible to the east of the line, are mixing with the natural light of the dawn. The night is over. The morning is beginning. The long industrial cluster of the Glasgow conurbation, of which Motherwell is the eastern outpost, is starting to wake up around the train. The Glasgow conurbation, in 1888, was one of the great industrial concentrations of the Victorian world. The valley of the Clyde, from Motherwell in the east to Greenock in the west, had been transformed over the past 100 years from a country of farms and market towns into a continuous belt of mines and ironworks and steelworks and shipyards and chemical plants and engineering factories, with a population approaching 1 million people and an industrial output that was, by some measures, larger than that of any other comparable region in Europe. The shipyards alone, on the lower Clyde at Govan and Partick and Clydebank, were producing 1/5 of the world's new shipping tonnage. The steel works at Motherwell and Coatbridge were among the largest in Britain. The locomotive works at Springburn, in the north of Glasgow, were the largest in Europe. The chemical industry at St. Rollox produced soda and bleach and dyestuffs that were exported across the world. All of this was crammed into the valley of a single Scottish river, in a region that had been 3 generations earlier mostly agricultural country with a few weaving villages. The transformation was the work of the Industrial Revolution applied to a particular geography. The coal and iron of the Lanarkshire Field, the deep navigable estuary of the Clyde, the technical genius of a series of Glasgow engineers from James Watt onward, and the labour of a population swelled by Highland and Irish immigration through the 19th century. By 1888 the city was at the height of its powers. The merchants and manufacturers of Glasgow were among the richest men in Britain. The terraced sandstone tenements that housed the working population stretched for mile after mile across the city. The Victorian civic architecture, the city chambers in George Square, the Kelvingrove Art Gallery then under construction, the great churches and theatres and concert halls, testified to the cultural confidence of a city that knew itself to be one of the great industrial capitals of the world. The city's history reached back well before the railway age, of course. Glasgow had been a cathedral city in the medieval period, with its university founded in 1451, making it one of the 4 oldest universities in the English-speaking world, and it had been a market town and a port from the 17th century onward. Its rise to industrial prominence had begun with the tobacco trade with the American colonies in the 18th century, when the Glasgow tobacco lords had built the first of the great mansions in the merchant city east of George Square. The American Revolution had ended the tobacco trade, but the merchants had reinvested their capital in cotton manufacture and in the developing chemical industry. The city had transitioned into the textile age and then into the engineering age through the first half of the 19th century. By 1888, 4 phases of the city's commercial history, the cathedral period, the tobacco period, the cotton period, and the engineering period, were all visible in different parts of the urban fabric, layered on top of each other in a way that gave Glasgow a particular density of historical character that the more recently developed industrial cities of England did not quite share. You are coming into the eastern approaches of this city now. The first signs of the industrial conurbation are visible from the train. The long brick walls of mill yards beside the line, the lit windows of foundries where the night shift is finishing, the dim shapes of gasometers, the chimneys of small factories pushing the first smoke of the morning into the brightening sky. The country has changed in the half hour since Beatock from upland sheep pasture to industrial valley, and the change is one that the railway passenger of the 1880s found dramatic, the abruptness with which the empty country gave way to the most concentrated industrial landscape in Britain. The train runs through Newton, it runs through Cambuslang, it runs through Rutherglen, an ancient royal burgh that the city of Glasgow had absorbed by the end of the 19th century, but that still kept its own identity in 1888. The line is now flanked on both sides by tenements and by industrial buildings. The signal gantries become more frequent. The lit windows of working buildings are continuous on either side. The dim shapes of locomotives at rest in goods yards pass at intervals. The eastern suburbs of Glasgow are around you, and beyond them, ahead, is the city itself. You may be waking up too. The waking on a night sleeper in the last hour before arrival has its own character that is unlike any other waking the modern traveller experiences. You are not waking in your own bed. You are not waking in a hotel. You are waking in a moving room that has carried you while you slept into a country you were not in when you closed your eyes. The body, slowly returning from sleep, takes a few moments to reconcile its sense of the world. There is the rocking, which it now recognizes. There is the click of the wheels, which it has been hearing for 10 hours, and which has become inaudible until you concentrate on it. There is the dim grey light beginning to show at the edges of the curtain, which is no longer the dim of last night's dusk, but the dim of a new morning. There is the deepening of the engine note as the train slows for some signal ahead. There is the body's slow recognition that it is on a train, that the train is moving, that the train has been moving all night, that the train is now arriving somewhere. You stretch very slightly. You feel the bedclothes against your body and the railway pillow under your head and the gentle pull of the train as it takes a curve. You let yourself be aware for a few seconds of the strangeness of the situation, of having lived a whole night inside a vehicle, of having dreamed dreams that had been carried 400 miles by your sleeping body, of having woken up in a country you had never been in before. There is a private wonder in this kind of waking that the night sleeper produced, and that the air travel of the next century never quite reproduced. Air travel got you there faster, but it left you tired, and you woke from any sleep you managed in your seat with the kind of bone-deep weariness that long-haul flights deliver. The night sleeper, by contrast, delivered you to your destination rested. You arrived in Glasgow with the energy to start your day. The Victorians who used the night sleeper for business found this to be one of its principal advantages, and the senior commercial men who travelled often between London and Scotland would talk about it as one of the great practical benefits of the rail age. The steward, sometime after 5 o'clock, has come down the corridor knocking softly at each compartment door. You hear him at the door of the next berth. 3 soft taps, the murmur of the occupant's reply, the click of the latch, the steward's voice low and pleasant, the chink of china being set down on a side table, then his footstep in the corridor again, then the same routine at the berth on the other side of yours. Then he is at your door. He brings hot water for the washstand and a small tray with tea and biscuits and a slice of bread and butter in the early breakfast that Pullman passengers received as part of the fare on the night service. He knocks at your door now. You answer. He brings the tray in and sets it on the side table. The tray is set with a silver teapot, a milk jug, a sugar bowl with tongs, a porcelain cup and saucer with the company's monogram on the rim, a side plate of biscuits, a slightly larger plate with the bread and butter folded in triangles. A linen napkin folded in a precise rectangle is tucked under the teapot. He says, "Good morning." He asks if you slept well. You say you did. He says we will be at Glasgow Central in 40 minutes. He goes out and pulls the door closed. You sit up. The compartment is dim. The reading lamp is off. There is grey light at the edges of the curtain. You pour yourself a cup of tea. The pot is hot in your hand. The tea comes out the colour of old mahogany. You add milk from the jug. The milk clouds the tea, the way it always does, with the same particular swirl that the eye recognises as the moment a cup of tea becomes ready to drink. You add a single lump of sugar from the bowl. You stir with the silver spoon. You raise the cup. The first sip of hot tea in a Pullman berth at 5 in the morning after a night of being carried 400 miles through the dark is, perhaps, one of the small good things that the late Victorian world had quietly perfected. The tea is hot and strong and freshly made, the kind of railway tea that the great companies took some pride in, and the milk is fresh and cold. The biscuits are plain and faintly buttery. The bread and butter is on a plate with a sprig of parsley for garnish. You eat slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed in your nightclothes, looking at the strip of grey sky that is now visible at the bottom of the curtained window, where the steward, when he set the tray down, has pulled the curtain back a few inches. Beyond the curtain, the country has changed. The moorland and the open uplands of an hour ago have given way to an industrial landscape, a country of mines and forges and rail yards and tenement blocks and gasworks and workmen's cottages, set in the long valley of the Clyde with the river itself sometimes visible in the middle distance. The chimneys of the iron works at Coatbridge and Airdrie can be seen to the east. The shipyards on the lower Clyde, although still some miles away, are throwing the first columns of their morning smoke into the brightening sky. If you lift the curtain now, in the last 20 minutes before Glasgow, you will see a country that does not look like the country you fell asleep in. The Coatbridge furnaces, 3 miles to the east of the line, are throwing long flares of orange light up into the paling grey sky every 2 or 3 minutes, as the metalworkers tap a heat. The flares light the underside of the smoke cloud over the Monklands ironfield. The smoke cloud itself is thick and heavy and is being pulled by the prevailing west wind across the line ahead of the train, so that for a stretch of 2 or 3 miles the carriage will run through air that is browner than the morning should be. The tenement blocks on either side of the line are mostly dark, although here and there an upper window is lit where some early rising man is shaving by lamplight for the 6 o'clock shift. The gasometers are dim shapes against the sky. The collieries have their lit headstocks above the shafts, and the dim figures of the morning shift can be seen at the cage gates, waiting to be taken down for their day's work. This was the country that the night sleeper delivered its passengers into when it brought them to Glasgow in the late 19th century. The contrast with the moorland of the southern uplands an hour back was abrupt. The contrast with the green country of England the previous evening was complete. The journey had been from one of the great cities of the world to another of the great cities of the world, through a stretch of mostly empty country in the middle, and the second city, when it arrived around the train, arrived all at once. You are coming into Glasgow. Glasgow, in 1888, was the second city of the British Empire. Only London was larger, and only London was busier. Glasgow had a population of just over 600,000. It was the largest centre of shipbuilding in the world. The Clyde alone was producing more tonnage of new vessels than any other industrial river anywhere, and it was a major centre of locomotive building, of textile manufacture, of chemical industry, of food processing, and of trade. Its merchants traded with the West Indies, with India, with the Americas. Its banks had financed half the railways of the United States. Its tobacco lords had built the great mansions of the West End in the early 19th century, and its shipping magnates were now building the even greater mansions of Pollockholds and Bearsden. The city had its own university, its own art gallery, its own great cathedral, its own theatre, its own opera house, its own daily newspapers. It was, in 1888, in the high noon of its industrial confidence. The train, while you finish your tea and dress and pack your travelling bag, runs through the eastern suburbs of the city. It passes through Uddingston. It passes through Cambuslang. It crosses the River Cart on a long bridge. It enters the southern approaches to Glasgow Central, where the Caledonian Railway's main terminus had been built and rebuilt over the past 40 years to handle the volume of traffic that the city's growing economy generated. The signal gantries of the central area come into view ahead. The line widens to a dozen tracks. The lit windows of trackside warehouses and the marshalling yards of the Caledonian Railway pass on either side. The train slows. The engine is now working at the lightest pressure of the entire journey, easing the train into the station throat with the controlled deceleration of a Caledonian driver who has done this run 1,000 times. You dress carefully in your travelling clothes. You fold your night clothes into your bag. You straighten the bed as best you can, although the steward will strip and remake it before the next service. And you make sure you have your gloves and your hat and your travelling cloak. You glance at yourself in the dressing mirror that the Pullman company had thoughtfully installed on the inside of the door of each berth. Your hair is reasonable. Your face is not too creased by the pillow. You have, despite a night spent on a moving bed in a strange country, the appearance of someone who has rested. The night sleeper has done its work. You step out into the corridor with your bag. Other passengers are emerging from their berths in the same condition, gentlemen in travelling suits with their valises, ladies in cloaks with their dressing cases, all of them slightly bleary but recognisably ready to face the day. The corridor smells of fresh tea and of the early breakfast the steward has been distributing. There is the murmur of polite voices. There is the slight bustle of preparation for arrival. The whole carriage, 10 hours after the long-lit interval at Euston, is reassembling itself for the morning. The train enters Glasgow Central Station at 3 minutes to 6 in the morning. The train shed, lit from within by gas lamps, and from above by the early morning light coming through the great glazed roof, opens around the train as the carriages move under the canopy. The platforms are populated with porters and station staff and the few early travellers waiting for outbound trains. There is the regular activity of a great terminus at the start of the working day. The postmen waiting with their carts to collect the mail bags from the travelling post office, the station hotel porters waiting to receive the luggage of guests, the cab drivers in the rank outside, the newspaper boys with the first editions of the morning papers. Your train comes to a stop at platform 2. The carriages give a final shudder against the buffers. The engine, having brought you the last 150 miles, releases its brakes with a long pneumatic sigh and stands at the head of the train, hot and still, while the railway servants come down the platform to begin the work of detaching it. The whistle blows once briefly in announcement. The journey is over. You step down from the carriage onto the platform. The air in the train shed is cool with the first of the morning, and it has the particular smell of a Glasgow station at dawn coal smoke from 100 lit station fires somewhere overhead, the slight oil of the locomotive, fresh newsprint from the boys at the newsstand, the Salton River note of the Clyde drifting up the platforms from the south, and underneath all of it, the porter's carbolic from the cleaning of the train shed during the night. You look up at the great roof of Glasgow Central, with its glazed bays admitting the morning light. You look down the platform at the long line of Pullman cars that has carried you through the night. You look at the locomotive, simmering at the head of the train, and you see for the first time the men who have been driving you for the last stretch, driver Stewart and fireman Cameron, both blackened with coal dust and tired, climbing down from the footplate with their tin tea cans in their hands, going to the mess room for breakfast and a wash before the next turn. They do not look at you. You do not particularly look at them. The arrangement that has carried you through the night, that whole long cooperation of crews and signalmen and stewards and sorters, is now dispersing, each man going to his own breakfast, his own bed, his own next shift. The steward of your carriage stands at the bottom of the steps with the small leather satchel into which the gratuities are collected. You give him the appropriate sum. He thanks you. He says he hopes you slept well. He says that the cab rank is to the right of the main station entrance, and that the porters will help with the luggage. He moves on to the next passenger. You walk down the platform. A porter takes your bag. You walk together up the platform toward the station concourse. With the long-lit train behind you and the morning ahead, your night journey is over. You have travelled 400 miles in your sleep. You have arrived in Scotland with the morning. The night sleeper has delivered you, as it had delivered tens of thousands of passengers across the past 15 years, into the morning of a new day, in a country you had not been in when you went to bed. The walking off the train at Glasgow Central, with the porter ahead and the bag and the hat in hand, was one of the iconic moments of long-distance travel that the Victorian period had invented. It is the moment that completes the journey. It is the moment that delivers you, in your travelling clothes and with the night still in your hair, into the new day. The morning at Glasgow Central, in the long high-glazed train shed with the gas lamp still burning under the iron roof, has its own quiet character that the regular Pullman passengers recognised year after year, and that the writers of the period sometimes described the sense of having stepped off the moving world into the still one, of having completed something, of having earned the day that was now opening around you with the help of the train and the men who had run it through the night. This was the gift of the railway. This was what the Victorians had built in the second half of the 19th century that no earlier civilization had ever quite managed. The ability to lie down in one bed and wake up in another bed 400 miles away, in a different country, having spent the time between unconscious, was a kind of casual conjuring with distance that the world before the railway would not have believed possible. The early travellers who first used the night sleepers commented on it in their letters. They said it felt like a kind of magic. They said they could not quite believe, looking out of their carriage windows at the unfamiliar morning country, that they had moved through that distance in the night without doing anything. They had, in a real sense, been carried by the country itself, by the engineering of its rails, by the labour of its railwaymen, by the cooperative system of its signalmen, by the design of its carriages, across a stretch of geography that earlier ages would have crossed only with conscious effort and considerable hardship. The night sleeper to Scotland, in the form you have just travelled it, did not last forever. The Pullman service on the west coast was reorganised in the 1900s, when the LNWR began to operate its own sleeping carriages without the Pullman branding. The engineering of the trains improved over the next 30 years. The night sleeper survived the First World War and survived the grouping of the railways in 1923, when the LNWR became part of the new London Midland and Scottish Railway, and survived the Second World War, and survived the nationalisation of the railways in 1948. The route between Euston and Glasgow continued to carry overnight passengers right through the 20th century, with diesel locomotives replacing the steam engines after the late 1950s and electric locomotives replacing the diesels in the 1970s. The night sleeper to Scotland is still running tonight under the Caledonian Sleeper brand, with carriages that the original Pullman engineers would recognize in concept, but that are far more comfortable than anything they could have designed. The route is still the West Coast Main Line. The engineering work at Tring and Kilsby and Camden is still in use. The signal boxes, although now controlled by computers from a central operations centre rather than by individual signalmen pulling levers, still occupy the same locations. The line is still being run every night by the labour of railwaymen and women whose job is to deliver the sleeping passengers to Scotland by morning. That continuity is one of the quietly remarkable facts of British railway history. The track you rode tonight in 1888 is, in most of its essentials, the track that runs north tonight in the present. The sleeper service has been running on that same track for 140 years. The men and women who run it today are doing the same essential work as Driver Robinson and Fireman Carruthers and Driver Stewart and Fireman Cameron, although with better equipment and shorter shifts and fewer hazards. The Victorians built something that proved durable. They built something that has lasted longer than they could have imagined, and the experience of lying in a Pullman berth and being carried through the dark from London to Glasgow, with the engine working ahead and the wheels clicking beneath, has not fundamentally changed in its emotional substance since the first night sleepers ran in the 1870s. If you have ever lain on a sleeper train in your own life, and many people have, although fewer than once did, you will know the feeling. The dim of the compartment, the weight of the bedclothes, the regular click of the wheels, the unseen country passing beyond the curtained window, the faint sense of the engine working far ahead, the strange knowledge that you are moving through the dark while the world sleeps around you and the country slides past. It is a feeling that the 19th century invented. It is a feeling that has its own quiet emotional weight, and that I think most travellers who have experienced it remember with affection long afterward, regardless of how many other journeys they may have made. The steward in 1888 has now stepped off the train. The other passengers are dispersing along the platform. The porters are wheeling luggage trolleys toward the cab rank. The train is being prepared for its return south. The carriages will be cleaned, the linen changed, the locomotive turned and refuelled, and the whole formation will leave Glasgow at 9:30 tonight to retrace your route in the opposite direction, carrying a different set of passengers from Scotland to England by the same route through the same dark. You walk out through the station concourse. The morning light is now full. The clock above the booking office reads 6:10. The newspaper sellers are calling out the headlines of the day. The cab rank is busy with hansoms and four-wheelers waiting to take the early arrivals to their hotels or their offices or their lodging houses. The porter, with your bag, leads the way. The Glasgow morning, cool and grey, and full of the smoke of 100,000 coal fires being lit for breakfast, opens around you. You have arrived. You have slept your way into a new country. The night sleeper carried perhaps 100 passengers a train. It was hauled by an engine that used 4 tons of coal between London and Crewe and another 4 between Crewe and Glasgow. It was driven by 3 crews of 2 men each, working in succession through the night. It was passed forward by 80 signalmen in lit boxes along the route. It crossed the border between 2 countries while its passengers slept. It arrived at Glasgow Central in time for breakfast. It did all of this on a regular nightly basis throughout the year, with a reliability that the British public had come to take for granted by 1888, and that, looking back at it now, ought to inspire a certain quiet admiration. Tonight, in the listening, it has been your train. The bed has been your bed. The morning has been your morning. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one.